It's my pleasure to introduce then Dr. Dan Siebert. Dan?
Good morning, Ray. Good morning, folks. Just want to thank everyone for taking some time out of their schedule today to plug in and visit with these NRCS watershed leaders and to learn a little bit more about the program. The coalition appreciates your good work, and we hope that you'll find today's webinar instructive and enlightening. And it is an opportunity to speak with NRCS leaders about the program and make suggestions and ask questions. So I hope that you'll engage and enjoy the time we have together this morning.
Well, thanks, Dan. You might talk a little bit about the National Watershed Coalition and its organization and how to be involved, that sort of thing?
Sure. We are a 501c3 organization. We have a variety of types of members, which include both watershed sponsors, individuals, other groups that have an interest or a stake in the watershed program. And we have said for many years that we believe natural resource problems are best dealt with utilizing a watershed as a planning unit and an implementation unit. Our focus revolves around the USDA NRCS Small Watershed Program. Currently, Lisa Knopf Owen from Oklahoma is our chair. Rex Isom from Texas is our immediate past chair. And our vice chair is currently vacant, but soon to be filled. And then Barb Oltgen of Kansas is our longtime secretary treasurer. We are governed by a board of directors. There are several membership levels available to you if you're interested in joining the coalition. Those can be found on our website, or you can get to our website via our Facebook page if that's your preferred cup of tea.
Hope we didn't lose you, Dan.
You did not. Just doubling back, we have a board of directors steering committee that's composed of individuals and representatives from organizations and associations that have an interest in the watershed program. We provide assistance to both the project sponsors and NRCS. We conduct workshops and training sessions, and also serve as a resource to connect sponsors to other sponsors who have had successful construction or rehabilitation projects so that they can share information. We provide assistance in developing strategies and sources of project funding. We have actually put on a couple of webinars about funding and how to manage funding. We also hold a biennial watershed conference. Our next one will be the first week in October in Spokane, Washington. There'll be some information near the end of the webinar today about that meeting, so you might make a note of that. We have a whole series of downloadable publications on our website, watershedcoalition.org. And obviously maintain a website and a Facebook page. There's a laundry list of website contents, all of which are downloadable and can be used with board members, the public, etc., to educate folks about the watershed program.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate those opening remarks and a little bit about the National Watershed Coalition. How does one get involved in the National Watershed Coalition, Dan?
We're a membership organization. We are we're an organization of organizations. So there are individual memberships, there are organizational memberships, and then what we call steering committee memberships, each at a different price point. And we welcome any and all. You're all welcome. Our strength is in the collective intellectual property of our members. So we're always glad to have folks align themselves with us.
So more done together than we could ever do just individually as organizations or individuals. And I bet they could probably find at that website, www.watershedcoalition.org, the information on how to become a member and how to contribute.
They can. There is there's a copy of a recent membership mail out on the website, and you can download that, fill it out, send it in. We'll get you taken care of.
My sense is the National Watershed Coalition has had a great deal of influence on decision making and things that go on a statewide and national scale.
Well, we can't take credit for everything that's happened, but we believe because we exist that we're in a better spot today than we were yesterday, and certainly better than we have been during some periods in the past.
Yeah, having worked with the organization for many years in many different positions I've had, I know that they've had a great deal of influence and have done a great deal of work sharing and bringing watershed folks together and watershed programs. This webinar being one of those. Well, let's talk a little bit about logistics. All our lines are muted except for the presenters. You've probably already guessed that. So our panelists today, again, include myself and Dan, you just heard from, Ralph Smith and Kevin and Jesse and Andrew, we've also got with us today. So we're pleased with our panelists, and they'll be speaking with you in just a bit. So the registration questions gave our panelists a great deal of information that they could prepare their remarks on. And so much of what you're going to hear in the next few minutes is going to be some answers to questions that many of the folks had during the registration questions period. Now, that being said, there are some questions that we're going to handle during the course of the webinar. And if you do have a question for one of our presenters, using the chat feature like you did to put in National Watershed Coalition today, you can use that chat feature on your computer and we'll pull those up, get to as many questions as we can. The good news is, and Kevin, are you with me? Let's unmute you, make sure you're there.
I'm here, Ray.
I think you had some great news regarding some follow-up on if we didn't get to all the questions or there were some questions better handled a different way. Talk with us about that.
Yes, Ray, in the event, and hello, everyone. Good morning. I see we have 129 participants. And as Ray had mentioned, we did receive a number of great questions from the registrants, well over 360 questions. So we're at a position now to want to, as an agency, to respond to every last question. That includes both the internal and external questions that we receive. So in an effort to be as transparent and as accountable as we can as a program, we're going to provide written responses for all of the questions. That includes the ones that we're going to answer during the session today, as well as some of the ones that we'll answer during the Q&A. You'll have presentation answers, Q&A answers, and then we're going to follow up for those that we didn't get, plus all the ones that we did answer with written responses to all of the questions. Now, I will admit some of the questions said not applicable or no particular question now. Well, obviously we won't respond to that, but we will give you responses for those that had direct questions that we could actually answer directly.
So Kevin, you're a facilitator's dream come true. My heart goes pity-pat over the fact that you would do that and follow up with all the questions, those that will be answered, those that haven't been answered yet, and that sort of thing, and some that are just better in writing, huh? So that you've got something, tangible. So folks, you have really joined a great webinar here that's going to provide you a great deal of information during and after the webinar. Presentation is going to be recorded, and then also any feedback, kudos, comments, that sort of thing, just send them my way, rayledgewood@msn.com. Our agenda for today: welcome, self-introductions, objective, agenda, logistics, and we're just about through that. And then we're going to move right to the watershed programs utilization training. And so while we've talked about Public Law 566, Kevin's going to also talk, and his staff are going to talk about several of the watershed programs. And I'm excited about learning a little bit more about all that myself. The program questions and answers, again, we're going to pull up some of the registration questions that you had, and then any of the questions that come in during the course of the event today, we're going to either answer during the event or in writing after the event, as Kevin had mentioned. And then we're going to take a break. About 90 minutes or so, into our 3 hours today, we'll take a break, and then we'll come back to a listening session. This is where we're going to be program recommendations, maybe some questions and discussions again, some feedback to NRCS watershed programs folks. All right, we're going to talk and finish the day at the end with the program timelines, and then also a little bit about the National Watershed Coalition events that are upcoming. And Dan gave you a little bit of a forecast of that just a few minutes ago, with the meeting coming up in Spokane later this fall. Closing remarks and adjourn. So again, by way of introduction, our speakers then are Branch Chief Kevin Farmer, the Watershed Programs Branch, Jesse Wilson, our National Program Manager for Watershed Rehabilitation, Ralph Smith for National Program Manager, Watershed Operations. They'll be tag teaming here and talking quite a bit about those questions that came in. And then this is really going to be an overview of the USDA NRCS watershed programs, including program utilization, application process, information and data collected needed, budget development, implementation, reporting. Examples also, and Kevin's been working hard and his staff been working hard to find examples of outstanding PL566 applications, projects, and activities. And shout out to Andrew Ryan, who also was a part of this team and helped with many of the presentation slides today. So Kevin, let me switch it over to you and let you take control of the machine and the presentation and so forth. So let's see if we can do that.
Still showing disabled, but I think it'll probably click over in a minute.
Okay.
And if it doesn't, I'll be happy to go through the presentation that you have.
Let's try it one more time, see if it'll come up.
I'm happy to use the one that you have, right?
Okay.
That's not a problem.
All right. Let's do that one more time, Kevin, and see if we can make that work for you. That would be great. And then okay. Try now.
Oh yeah. All right. There we go.
Are you looking good?
I'm looking great on this end. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
For all of you that are listening, that was your moderator.
All right. Thank you, Ray.
You bet.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks everyone for being here. See, we're up to 132 people. So I am hopeful that throughout the course of this presentation, we will be able to provide meaningful insight on the basic programs that we are offering through the Watershed Programs Branch, and then some helpful information and insight on how the program can be accessed and also how it actually can be implemented. So we look forward to most of the discussion occurring during the question and answer session and then during the listening session. So that's where we really want to engage and get to a lot of most of the interest for this group. So for the first part, I'm going to just go through some of the basics and a big overview of the program and highlight some of the examples of success that we've had. So I'm going to go through that right now. So as Ray had mentioned, within the Watershed Programs Branch, there are actually 3 unique and distinct programs. We have the Watershed Operations Program. We call it the Watershed Flood Prevention and Operations Program. Many of you are familiar with that program. But we also have, under that authority of PL566, the Watershed Rehabilitation Program. We're going to talk about that today. And we also have a unique disaster recovery program that many of you have accessed that we also administer through this Watershed Programs Branch. And that's the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. We're going to talk about that program today and give you an opportunity to see some of the very unique things that you can do to immediately help communities recover during a major disaster. So we're going to talk about that. So just as an overview of these 3 programs, the way this presentation is set up, we're going to keep going through many of these things repetitively and you're going to see a section on watershed ops, a section on watershed rehab, and then a section on EWP. So for watershed operations, that program provides state, local, and tribal governments an opportunity to protect watersheds by installing vital infrastructure. So we're working with local sponsors, that's those state, local, and tribal governments, to protect their watersheds through the installation of infrastructure. These benefits communities in every state and every territory. Similarly, rehab provides technical and financial assistance to these same sponsors to rehabilitate and extend the service lives of dams that were originally constructed through that watershed operations program. And then lastly, the EWP program, it is a separate program, not necessarily directly tied to watershed operations or rehab, but it does provide for that emergency repair and restoration and recovery assistance throughout the watershed that helps to remove those impairments that create sudden impairments that are erosion related that threaten life and property. All of these programs are working with a local sponsor. Now, funding. So as you look at this program, we have just under $2 billion over the last 5 years that have been appropriated for all 3 of these programs. And as you look at it, the breakdown, you can see the most has gone to EWP, but it's very cyclical. We get disaster supplemental appropriations. So there are no annual appropriations for EWP. So funding is normally as it's annual, it's multi-year funding that can be used until expended normally. There may be some restrictions at times, but the funding you're seeing is that Hurricane Harvey and Maria and Irma and those large hurricanes we had in 2017. Well, in 2018, we received funding for those, and that's why you see that large $541 million, in addition to some wildfires and other major disasters that happened during that period. And similarly, when we had the derecho in Iowa and some of those other events in the Midwest flooding in 2018, well, we saw funding in 2019 that you see there that resulted from that. However, as I'd mentioned, these are not annual dollars. These are multi-year, no-year funds is what we call them, that we can use throughout the life of the program until expended. And then with rehab, you'll see on average, there's about $10 million for that program each year for the last 3 years. And there were some slight adjustments or increases in prior years before that, but on average, it's around about $15 million if you wanted to average it out over that 5 years. For the watershed operations program, you can see that for the last 5 years, we've at least averaged at least 150, and then in 2019, it jumped some to 200 million. And then in 2020 and 2021, 2019, 2020, and 2021, we received Farm Bill funding all 3 of those years. And that $50 million in Farm Bill funding can actually be used for watershed ops or rehab. But because of the needs there in watershed ops and the ability to do some quick construction type work, we've mostly allocated those funds towards the construction and watershed ops. Some has gone to rehab, but those are annual funds, and we really want to get those funds to projects that we know can be completed within a set period of time and go into construction. So when you start looking at some of the work that has been funded, the way the funds have been distributed in the last fiscal year, 17 states were funded in watershed operations, 16 in rehab, so about the same number of states. And then 33 states were funded for EWP, which I mentioned earlier. There's no direct correlation between ops and rehab and EWP. EWP is kind of its own program, but you can see the closeness in the relationship between ops and rehab. And for that breakdown, a lot of it went towards the initial assessments and investigation type work that we funded for watershed ops in both rehab. Now that's in project numbers. When you start looking at the total dollars, you'll see in the next slide that actually more of that money went down to other phases like implementation phases. We were able to fund 38 plans for watershed ops and about 28 for rehab. And then in the design phase, we funded a few less for that design phase for both programs. And then in construction, we were funding less. And the reason because of that is because you'll see we kind of, we're taking care of the planning up front, and there are projects that have been funded for construction in previous years. So this is just showing that 1 year. But as you're completing those plans, projects are coming ready for construction. As you're completing designs, projects are coming ready for construction. So we're projecting that in the next few years, those construction numbers are going to go way up. We have at least 10 projects this year in rehab that are expected to be completed for construction. So we're starting to see an uptick in construction. And as a result of that, that's going to actually impact numbers of funding in this next slide. So now what you're seeing is actually that distribution of funding, the actual dollars. So that first line didn't change as far as the states, but the actual amounts of funding, you'll notice that there was a change. You can see, although we funded a lot of assessments and plans, the volume of the value of those dollars or the amount of funds allocated is a lot lower when you start looking at those few designs and few construction projects that were actually funded. So you can see, obviously, the need for design and construction funding really dominates the actual funding of the funding amounts in the program. And as that design and that construction goes up and more plans are authorized, we're going to actually see a lot more demand for design and construction dollars. And as those numbers go up, it's going to be really challenging to meet some of those needs as you look at it, because the annual cost for those programs at those phases are going to be very expensive, because construction design is those are pretty expensive phases. We can do a lot of planning, a lot of assessments, but when it comes to the point of having to do design and construction, you really have to have quite a bit of funds and resources to be able to meet all the demand there. So that's what we're looking at in this slide. Remedial has gone down. You wouldn't expect remedial to keep going up. Once we've addressed the remedial, hopefully we won't see more remedial needs. We are hoping that dams are resilient as they have been, and that we've taken care of all the deficiencies, or most of those deficiencies that we can take care of. So you're going to see that number keep going down, hopefully. So this is just a look at how funds were distributed last year. Now, let's get into the actual programs and kind of talk about some of what these programs offer and what we're looking at when we get into the programs. So I'm going to go through Watershed Ops first. So in order to be eligible for the Watershed Operations Program, you must have a public sponsor. That's the very first thing. Local landowners who want to do work within their watershed, they must work through one of those public sponsors, and we'll define that more going forward. Watershed projects up to 250,000 acres. So one individual project cannot exceed 250,000 acres. However, you can subdivide a project and exceed that. I will state that there were legislative changes that allowed for funds appropriated in 2020 and 2019, as well as some in 2021, to be able to waive that restriction on the size limit for non-flood protection projects. So if the primary purpose was not flood protection, we can exceed that 250,000 acres. Now, the maximum total capacity for any individual structure is 25,000 acre feet. Now, 20% of the benefits must be agriculture related. Now, that's a statutory requirement that 20% be agriculture related. Anything beyond that is not acceptable or eligible for participation in the program. In addition to that, authorized NRCS watershed plans must be provided. So that's one of the things that's very critical. So let's go to the next one. So as an overview, NRCS assists local sponsors to implement watershed projects. That's how the program is administered. Projects are led by local sponsors with federal input. So these are all locally led, and there's all federal input being provided here, but locally led. NRCS provides technical and financial assistance to sponsors to complete a project. So as the projects are moving forward, we're providing both that TA, which can be dollars, or it can be staff, resources, people, to help in assisting in the completion of the project. As I mentioned earlier, our project size cannot exceed 250,000 acres unless it is one of those that we received funding for in 2019, 2020, and 2021, where we're able to exceed those limits for non-flood protection. Otherwise, you have to stay within that limit. As well, 20% of the benefits must be rural and agriculture related. That is a statutory requirement. We cannot get around that. It must be 20% ag or rural benefits. 20% of those total benefits have to be attributed to that, and we have to stick with that. An NRCS authorized watershed plan is required. I know the question came up about the waiver. Some of the language in the Farm Bill about waiving the plan, as long as if it's considered to be duplicative. When you actually get down to it, there are certain requirements that are met through that plan that are not waivable. So NRCS still has a requirement to participate in developing a watershed plan that is authorized by NRCS. Now, that doesn't mean it can't build off of some prior efforts. There may be efforts that were locally done by the sponsor that we can build on. However, sponsors are not federal partners, and the federal agency has responsibilities that we must meet, especially as it relates to NEPA, that we have to meet and address, and those things cannot be waived just because a local sponsor did certain levels of analysis and investigation. There's a federal requirement that we have to meet. So there's always going to be some level of federal planning and work necessary. Now, in the event that we participated as, let's say, a cooperating agency with another federal agency on the development of a plan, we can then adopt that plan and then have it authorized. But there's still a small amount of work that can be done. So what it really gets to is there's a process in place that may help us to actually streamline or expedite things because of prior work being done. But we can't just wholesale adopt as a federal agency any work done by others that NRCS has not had any involvement in or taken a federal decision in.
So
In
Kevin,
addition to that,
if I might stop you right there, would you be willing to take a question or two on a particular slide that you've got up there?
absolutely, yes. This is for the audience, so let's do what we need to do. Yeah, let's do that.
We got one. Just kind of break
Okay.
up the, the presentation here a bit, but
Okay.
is it 20% ag or 20% ag or rural? One slide said only ag and the other one said rural / agriculture. If there's a
Perfect.
difference or not in a rural area and an ag area per watershed ops policy.
Yeah, there is no different. I think the one slide may have left rural off, but it is ag or rural. So
Ag
if there is a community that has rural, that is a rural community that is normally a population of less than 50,000, there's definitions of what rural means.
Yeah.
But if it's a direct benefit to a rural community, it could be ag or rural. Excuse me.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for letting me break in.
Okay, great question.
Yep.
As mentioned, any plan over $25 million of federal funding for construction will require congressional approval. That was elevated, raised, that threshold was raised from 5 million to 25 million here in 2018.
Mhm.
All right, so here's an outline of this particular program. Sponsors request NRCS assistance to do a plan authorization. So as a sponsor, you're in control. You initiate the request for plan authorization, either to carry out an existing plan that has already been authorized. We call that backlog. That's what it's called. Or to prepare an NRCS watershed plan EIA. This is a brand new plan. As well, NRCS will assist the sponsor with a project feasibility report and a preliminary investigation. Now, that is called we've renamed that and called it the PIFR, Preliminary Investigation Feasibility Report. Kind of a snappy name there, but it's basically the same type of report. The goal of this preliminary investigation and feasibility report is to help our NRCS state conservationists to make an educated decision on the feasibility of a project before requesting financial assistance to actually do planning. So before that happens, we are requiring that a preliminary investigation feasibility report be completed. And that will give our staff an opportunity to make a very educated decision on the value of moving forward for planning, and then obviously, hopefully into implementation. We want every plan that is authorized to be able to be implemented. We want every effort for planning to be able to be authorized. So that means we need to do some feasibility investigations to determine if some of the things out there that are proposed are actually feasible. And we encourage local participation, but ultimately it is NRCS's responsibility to work with the local sponsor to provide a document that informs our state conservationists.
So of course, we're going to get into these acronyms, and I have a teacher daughter, and she tells me that Dad, you gotta spell that out every once in a while. So the EI or EA and EIS. Better talk with us about those acronyms.
So those are NEPA terms. That's you actually have an EA is an environmental assessment. So it's an overall assessment of the environmental impacts that may be caused by a minor action. The environmental impact study is more of an in-depth study that looks broader into some major impacts, and it also deals with the scale and scope of a project. If it's going to be a $25 million project that requires congressional approval, you're going to need an EIS. If it's a project that's requiring a lot of local input, and there's a lot of local interest, and there's a bunch of potential impacted areas and some significant impacts, based on the scale and level of impact, you're going to most likely need an environmental impact statement more so than an environmental assessment. So we use the term EA/EIS because it could be one or the other.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Kevin.
Great question. So project sponsors will carry out and fund specific parts of the watershed plan. NRCS provides both that financial and technical assistance for all phases, planning, design, and construction. You'll notice I did not mention the preliminary investigation feasibility report because that's prior to actually getting into the program. So planning, design, and construction, but we're paying 100% for that preliminary investigation. So purposes. These are the purposes that we've identified for watershed ops: flood prevention and damage reduction, ag water management, development of a rural water supply, erosion and sediment control, fish and wildlife habitat enhancement, wetland creation, increased recreational opportunities. So as you look at it though, there's a breakdown of how those purposes may be cost shared for this particular program. If you look at flood prevention, we're doing basically 100% across the board. And then for watershed protection, 100% for engineering, but the construction cost may vary. And the reason you see those variances there is we cannot exceed what another USDA program would offer for similar types of watershed protection or similar practices and work. So we couldn't exceed, let's say, like an EQIP project for doing the same work at 75%. We couldn't go beyond that, but we could go up to 100% if, in fact, there isn't a program out there that offers the same opportunity at a lower rate. And then you'll see the variances beyond that. And then I even included rehab because that is actually a project purpose on the watershed operations. That's that relationship. But rehab has its unique cost shares, and it does go up to 100%. But there's some, there's some nuances behind that where you have that 65, 35%. And we'll get into that when we get to rehab. Let's keep moving on for now. So the watershed program status. So for right now in this particular program, watershed operations program, we have funded over 109 projects since 2017, for planning. And we've authorized 8 projects since 2017 for planning. For design, we've funded over 59 projects and completed over 24 designs. And for construction, we funded over 39 and completed over 6 projects for construction. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the trends, if you're going from planning to design and construction, if there are 109 plans out there and we're going to authorize all 109, at some point, they're going to have to be designed and constructed. And as the cost goes up for those phases, you're going to obviously see that there's going to be a huge demand for those projects that are gradually moving out of planning into design and construction. And that demand, we're going to start noticing that here in the coming year or two, where that demand is going to constantly go up because you can see already with 24 completed designs, all those projects are going to be ready for construction. So how to apply? So in order to apply for this program as a sponsor, you would want to submit what's called a standard form 424, and that's an application for federal assistance. You want to submit that to your NRCS local state office. It includes the information such as your contact information, the specific program, the project description, estimated amounts of funding, and your ability to meet the eligibility requirements. So that's all documented. You can also submit a letter of request. That's acceptable too, in order to participate. That can be submitted to your state office. Then the NRCS state office collects all these requests, and the agency makes a decision internally before it's submitted to headquarters at the state level to rank those requests and determine which ones should be moved forward. And they also would have some discussions with the sponsor about the feasibility of actually moving these forward. Sometimes the projects that are requested may not be able to be completed in a timely manner. And knowing that, it may not be in the best interest to submit those forward immediately. They may be better suited for another following subsequent year. Then proposals are submitted to our national office, ranked and funded accordingly as funds are available for different phases. Most likely, only one phase will be funded at a time, given the funding available. We wouldn't be able to fund planning, design, and construction. And the reason for that is obviously you don't want to tie up construction funds for a project that's stating in planning today, when you may actually need those construction projects for a different project that comes ready for construction sooner in a year or two. So you really want to make sure those funds are available when they're needed and when they can be used. Implementation. So once the project is funded, we go into implementation. Now, for the sake of time, I won't go through every detail on this slide because I'm actually going to repeat some of this later on. But just so you can know, it's selected for funding. Then we enter into an agreement with the sponsor to actually complete the work, whether it's depending on the phase it is. And then the technical work is completed by the sponsor or NRCS. But either way, NRCS has technical oversight over the work that's being completed, and we will review and approve the work. As you look at the durations, ideally, a PIFR should take up to 6 months. That's what we're expecting for those preliminary investigation feasibility reports, up to 6 months. Hopefully they're sooner. A planned EA or EIS could take up to 18 months. Ideally, EA should only take about a year. An EIS should only take about 18 months. Obviously, it does go over that time, but from the date that the agreement is signed and work commences, we're saying that it should only take about 18 months from the day work commences, not from the time funds are awarded. That's important to note. A lot of work goes up ahead of that to get an agreement in place. We're not counting that as that time. Design should only take up to 24 months. Sometimes it does go longer than that. And then the construction should be between 2 to 5 years. Those are all ideal. And some of what we want to do is work with you as local sponsors to help identify ways we can meet those ideal goals. So how does the actual planning documentation, how long does the planning documentation take? And this is what I was just explaining. For an EIS, it's about that 18 months to 2 years even sometimes, depending on the cost and the level of impact. And then the EA could approximately be that 1 year I talked about. There are some mandatory review periods. There are some review periods for a draft EIS, a final EIS, and a record of decision. So those review periods are required, and it could take up to 90 days for some of these different reviews. So those are statutorily required, and there's nothing we can do to get around those or shorten those review periods. We must provide the optimal time for public review and comment. So in order to be able to request.
Kevin, before we leave that one,
yes.
Do I remember right? Many of the registration questions that came in, Kevin, were back on that slide. That one that you did, that's like golden right there. We almost need to put lamination on that and hand it to all of our partners and sponsors and potential sponsors. It's like, how long does this actually take? You know, and in working and facilitating some meetings with some potential, projects, it's like,
yes,
okay, they want to know upfront, and this kind of manages expectations.
Yes.
So from the registration, was I right? Many of the registration questions said.
You are correct. There were a number of different variations of questions on how long it should take. How is the process? How does the process go? So this slide, and all of this will be presented later electronically. You'll have this slide deck. So you'll have this information, but this is critical. When you look at the timeframes, these are all ideal. And as Ray is saying, these are the timeframes we're looking at. And this is mostly for planning, obviously. I'll back up one slide. You'll see these are actually all 4 phases. When you start looking at all phases, the ideal timelines. And in order to accomplish that, it really takes close coordination between us at NRCS and working with the sponsor to have a solid plan of work in place, to identify all of the steps that are required, all of the folks that are involved, and the time frame each review and each process should take, and sticking to that schedule. But it does take close coordination and require close coordination with us at NRCS, working with our sponsors. And then being realistic, managing the workload. There may be other priorities that come up that really do shift things. And then, managing the workload to say, can I actually take on, 10 new watershed operations projects and 2 rehab projects? So all those things are things that we kind of see, and all those things are things that go into the decision making, even for even the funding decision on what we would fund based on the workload and capacity to be able to complete the projects. So all of that plays a part of it.
I so appreciate you going back to that. I know that the folks that are on the line appreciate you going back, kind of retap on that just in case they got diverted to something else. Hey, are there mandatory requirements for EA reviews like the environmental impact statement?
So there are requirements for public comment and review period still. We do allow time for those public comments and reviews. All of the work that we do at NRCS would have a period for public comment and review, and there's a time frame for all of those. So there is a period of review that is required for all of the work that we do.
Okay, and then while I broke in, just to give you a quick break here, you need a sip of water or something? I want to make sure you're okay. Take a sip of water.
Thank you. That helps.
Oh man, you need that. Whether we're in person or virtual, we always need a sip of water or tea or something. Hey, can you better define the PIFR? Another one of those acronyms that you displayed there and showed. What's a PIFR? And
yes, that preliminary investigation feasibility report is the report that we use to best inform our state conservationists, those local executives at the state level who make the final decision on what comes forward as far as a plan to be authorized by the chief of NRCS. This preliminary investigation feasibility report helps them to determine the feasibility of a project before going into planning. And when you think about it, this has always been required, but because this program is kind of restarting after almost 10 years of dormancy in 2017, it restarted. And there are a lot of new interested partners and sponsors out there with great project ideas. And some of them may or may not necessarily fit the model of eligibility for the program, or it may not fit in the best way. One good example is the 20% ag benefits, ag and rural benefits. If you don't meet that, it's clearly a no-go. Well, you don't want to get into planning, get down the road into a huge planning effort that could take over $1 million for planning and discover that midway. You know, this is something that we need to know up front. These are some decisions we need to know. Is there public acceptability? Is this project actually even feasible to be able to be implemented because something else that's going on with another federal agency? So all these are small questions that need to be answered, but they're critical, and they will help inform our state conservationists before making a decision to move forward a request for funding for planning authorization.
Okay. And I don't want to break into your presentation anymore, but just to warn you that there's a question about graphic about requirements for environmental assessment reviews, similar to the one shown for the environmental impact statement. So you
Okay.
may have a slide on that coming up. So I'll back
So
to
there
you.
was a question about that in the actual, I think, comments. And what we were going to do was provide a written response because there was some specific guidance that we wanted to provide as it relates to requirements for environmental assessments and EISs. There's some specific guidance we wanted to provide about that in writing for everyone. So actually, we were going to do that anyway.
Yeah, so don't be dismayed if you sent us a question that's going to be done in writing, even better, right? So
Yeah,
have it in writing.
because we want to make sure that the answer is clear and succinct for everyone that needs this, and that's a very critical one. So we want to get that written out for everyone.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for letting me break in again.
No problem, Ray. Thank you. And so as we move forward, as you're looking at, these are the things that are being required as a request for funding is being submitted from our state to national headquarters. In order for a planning update to be done, that's basically for those backlog projects. We are requiring that sponsor letter of request. Now, the term here is used letter of request. Obviously, it could be that SF 424, but we definitely need a request from the sponsor documenting their ability and to meet their eligibility requirements, as well as to meet their requirements for moving the plan forward. And then the plan of work I mentioned, and then the cost. Similarly, the same thing is needed for a plan to be reaffirmed for feasibility. So both of those are things that are done for backlog projects. A planning update is simply saying, hey, I have a plan that was authorized. It's been sitting on the shelf now for 7, 8 years, let's say. And we want to update it. We know that there's been downstream changes. There's been changes throughout the watershed. We know this plan may not be feasible. We know that. Let's update it. And we'll supplement the plan and update it. Then a plan reaffirming of feasibility, that is when we're saying, well, it is older than 5 years, but we don't necessarily know that there's been any changes. This plan may still be feasible as it was authorized 5 years ago. But we are requiring that the state actually determine that and make sure that the plan is feasible. That does not take more than 6 months either. Neither of these is what we call the PIFR. That's not the PIFR. That's something totally different. These are for authorized backlog projects already. A PIFR is for something brand new. Now, for that new planning, we would require that preliminary investigation report. There's a form that comes with that request also that has to be filled out. This is for NRCS state offices. So as a sponsor, you wouldn't normally get involved in that. That 424 is required. The plan of work is always required. That really helps us document all the tasks, all the timelines, and all the things and show that you actually have a plan to accomplish this work. And then the state agency's current priority ranking, that is required. And we want to make sure that that local ranking has taken place to make sure that this is in fact a priority. And then that cost estimate that must be developed and provided. And then for a supplement of an existing plan that's similar to that update, you're going to have that form. And then this is for rehab though. So you're going to do a dam assessment that would have been done already. And then you're going to provide the 424 and then a plan of work for the TA and the TA estimate. And then if you're completing supplements that are more than 5 years old, it would require that reaffirming of the feasibility still, because you have to do that as part of your supplement. And then the SF 424 and then the plan of work. You're seeing the plan of work repeated on every single one of these because that is so critical. You're seeing the TA repeated because we need to have that estimate of what the technical assistance needed is required. We've actually developed a form to help our states in documenting and estimating what that level of TA is that will be needed. We have a resource for that for our state offices. And then design, you have to have that completed supplemental plan that has been authorized before you can request design funding. And then we'll see that information. And then if you're going to reaffirm feasibility on a design, then you'll need that plan of work to show that you're just reaffirming the feasibility. Obviously the design has already been, completed before. You're just going back to redo a design that's been once completed that has been sitting. And then for construction, you at least have to have a 90% design before you can request construction funding. And then you have to document that land rights have been acquired, and then you have to show the plan of work in TA. So these are the requirements that we're requiring internally for our state offices to request assistance for these different phases for the watershed operations and even for the rehab program. So these are the things that we're requiring. As sponsors, you may help in some levels of this. You may help to develop some of these things, but mostly I'm just informing you because this is an NRCS requirement. So if you're wanting to see what the NRCS officers are doing to get these requests moved forward. All right, so budgeting. Now this is important. So sponsors must show evidence of commitment for funding in order to install, or operate and maintain a project. So you must show that you actually have the availability to commit funding to do your part of the cost share. No matter what the project is, there's always going to be a sponsor cost. I didn't say cost share, I said a sponsor cost. Obviously for flood protection and some of those purposes, there is 100% cost share, and NRCS covers all the planning, design, and construction costs. However, the sponsor is always responsible for land rights and always responsible for operation and maintenance. So those costs are costs that the sponsor would incur and has to be able to actually take on those costs. The sponsor may either perform all the contracting work for construction, or they may request NRCS to do it. So when you're budgeting, you want to know, is this going to be a locally led contract where I take on the full responsibility for the implementation and construction, or is it going to be a federally led contract? If it's local, there are going to be some TA requirements that the local sponsor is going to have to take on. I need to budget for that. Now you may be reimbursed for quite a bit of it because they may have been NRCS costs because you're now just accepting that responsibility, but you want to at least budget for it because you're always being reimbursed. So because you're being reimbursed, you want to make sure you have that outlay of funding to cover you before the reimbursement actually gets there. Sponsors provide upfront and then they're reimbursed, as I just said. Sponsors are not reimbursed for these things. So you want to be careful because you're not going to be reimbursed for permits and licenses that you acquire. You're not reimbursed for any operation and maintenance. That's your responsibility. And you're not reimbursed for technical services to implement M&I water supply. So that means to design a municipal and industrial water supply facility, to design that, you're not reimbursed for those technical resources to design it because that's not a function that NRCS would have taken on. So you're not reimbursed for that. Sewer facilities, just the same. You're not reimbursed for installing any sewer facilities in an urban area. That's not reimbursable. So those are all things you want to be mindful of when you're budgeting. So now here's a good success story. I do believe that we had some of our friends up in the Northeast. I had the pleasure of working in the Northeast as a state engineer up there in Rhode Island, not Massachusetts, but worked very well. I don't know if Carl is on, but he was one of my mentors. Carl Gustafson was a state engineer up there in Massachusetts. But Carl, you may remember this project. I'm not sure if you own or not, but at any rate, he was very successful in launching this project. And then Darren, I know you've worked with the partners up there in the Cape Cod Conservation District and the Barnstable County commissioners to actually bring this project to fruition and actually see it. So I'm not sure if they're on, but anyway, I do know that this was a very successful project that actually has phases still going on. But I was able to go up and tour some of the work that was done. There was issues with water quality degradation, fish and wildlife habitat depletion, and pollution from stormwater runoff. And as a result, NRCS helped to develop a watershed plan, and we installed larger culverts and fish ladders and dry wells and put in sand filters. The cost of this project was a little over $23 million, almost $24 million. And as a result, Provincetown was able to see areas where porous pavement was installed to improve water quality and runoff enhancement. We replaced the traditional asphalts in some of these areas. And then we also helped to reduce the pollution of shellfish resources in the harbor, which is critical in the Northeast. If you don't know about the shellfishing industry in the Northeast, it's very vital. So I would encourage anyone in that area to check this project out.
So Carl is on the line, by the way.
Carl is. Oh, right. All right.
If you need him to say anything,
all right. Well, he'll know this project.
I got it. Okay.
All right. Hello, Carl. Thanks. Great job you guys did here. All right. All right. So for watershed rehab, so the watershed rehabilitation program. So now we're transitioning. We have 2 more programs to cover. I'm going to go a little quicker. I spent a little bit more time on that watershed ops program because it's kind of like the mother program almost, you could say. So I'm going to go quicker through these next 2 programs, just so you know. Eligibility. Originally constructed projects through the watershed ops program. So in order to be eligible, you have to have a dam that was constructed through one of these 4 programs. PL566 Authority under Watershed Ops, PL78534, pilot or RC&D. It has to be. No other way can you get in the program. Priority is given to high-risk dams. We have over 2,000 high-risk dams. We've only rehabilitated 170, roughly almost 170 at this point. So priority is given to those high-hazard dams right now. We'll probably be doing that for the foreseeable future because that is a priority to get all of those rehabilitated first. NRCS provides the assessment, planning, design, and implementation assistance. Now, as I mentioned in that watershed ops slide, you did see that up to 100% for construction. Well, that is true. We can go up to 100% for construction, but the total rehabilitation cost can exceed that 65%. So when you start looking at the total project cost, you may not get to that 100% construction because you've cost shared other phases, so you may be limited. But we could pay up to 100% of the total construction cost, but we couldn't exceed 65% on the total rehab cost. So that's why I said there was a caveat there. So as an overview, this is authorized by the same authority, PL566. We have 11,840 dams and 1,271 watersheds that we've installed since 1948. Obviously, we're looking at aging dams, where you've seen watershed development, you've seen land use changes, I had mentioned before, sediment accumulation or structural deterioration. Those are some of the things that would prompt and facilitate the need for rehabilitation. Obviously, I didn't say O&M. O&M is not eligible for the watershed rehabilitation program. These are all things that happen over time as a result of the aging of the structure, not the lack thereof or the failure to operate and maintain it properly. Those are other deficiencies that wouldn't be eligible. Outline, similar to the other program we show for watershed ops, the sponsor requests NRCS assistance and assessment is completed for this one. So instead of a PIFR, we do a dam assessment for this program. It's similar to the same approach. It's informing the sponsor actually in this one and NRCS as far as the viability of actually moving forward for a supplemental plan and moving into the rehabilitation program. So that assessment is showing the viability. And then the design phase and the construction phase, which is very similar to what I explained in the watershed ops program. So some of the benefits, 47 million people have been protected. And some of the purposes for rehabilitation include that water supply. We can pay up to 50% for enhanced or improved added water supply. Sediment and erosion control. Obviously, these structures fill in over time because of sediment loading. So we do have an opportunity to address some of that. Public safety. There obviously could be an issue as hazard class changes, so public safety. And flood protection, same issue. Recreation may be a new benefit in wildlife habitat. So those are some of the benefits for rehabilitation.
You had a question on sediment removal. Is it eligible for the NRCS assistance during the rehabilitation work?
Yes, absolutely. So we could, one of the options could be the removal of sediment. That could be part of the actual solution and measure that is proposed. So that would be eligible for assistance under rehab.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, there are state and local laws that have to be followed in any sediment removal process, but it would be an eligible practice for us to remove the sediment.
Okay, thanks.
To participate in it. So as far as the status of this particular program, we have, as I mentioned, 2,379 high hazard dams, so over 2,000 dams. 1,728 of them have been assessed. So we're making progress and we are required to assess all of them. We have 261 dams that have been authorized for implementation. And as I mentioned, about 170, so 169 dams have been rehabilitated. 39 dams are in the design phase. There are 111 in the planning phase and 20 dams currently in the construction phase. And we expect by the end of the year, possibly 10 of those will be completed just this year. I think last year we completed about 12 dams in the rehab program. Obviously, if you look at the numbers, as I stated before, with 111 in planning, you can anticipate that as those plans are authorized, those 111 will one day need to be designed and constructed, and that day is coming soon. And then as those dams that are in design, they will gradually move into construction.
Kevin, you had a question in here too from one of our participants.
Mhm.
Can the watershed programs be used for deconstruction?
Yes, so we can do a decommissioning is what we call it.
Okay.
So in the event that we evaluate the alternatives and one of the alternatives is to decommission or take out a structure, that is a viable and acceptable alternative. And it's one that we actually encourage to be evaluated. And if that is determined to be the most feasible alternative, and it is the recommended alternative, we will participate in a decommissioning. It's basically a designed and planned removal of the structure that restores the habitat back to its original condition, and the values or functioning values are restored, and it allows for safe and hydraulic restoration of the floodplains and the structure that was previously there. So yes, we will participate in a decommission.
And before we leave the sediment removal, could financial assistance be part of that sediment removal if it meets state and federal law?
If it meets, there is an opportunity for financial assistance to be provided to participate in some of the removal of the sediment if it meets.
Okay, thanks so much.
NRCS work with sponsors to develop rehab requests. I think I mentioned that. And then requests are submitted to the NRCS National Office for ranking and funding. Implementation. Once a project is selected for funding, funds are allocated to the state office. So this implementation is basically the same as what you saw for watershed ops. It's the same type of implementation process, not really much change there. Now, for durations at the bottom there, I will say for assessments, up to 12 months is the time frame that we have for assessments. So we're saying that an assessment is up to 12 months. So if it takes more than 12 months, we would definitely say that it is, taking a little bit too long to assess that particular structure. And we want to encourage that they move pretty expeditiously. Plan EA, design and construction, those timeframes follow similarly with the plan, with the phases that were shown in watershed operations. So you won't see a huge deviation there. The only difference you may see there in construction is we would expect it not to take 5 years to construct. It would take up to maybe 3 years for rehabilitation. Budgeting. This is actually basically the same information that I provided before, so I won't go in detail to this again. The budgeting scenario for watershed rehab is very similar to what you're doing for watershed operations, so it's not anything really new here. So just wanted to regurgitate it so that you know it, so when you see the slides, it's the same type of information. And a success story here is the Dull Knife Project in Wyoming. Not sure if any of the folks in Wyoming are on, but we worked with the Dull Knife Irrigation District of Johnson County as our sponsor to restore the auxiliary spillway that had been severely eroded and severely damaged. And as a result of that, we were able to widen and put in a new auxiliary spillway, raise the top of dam, provide riprap protection, and install abutment drains. Total cost of this project for construction, we're talking about the total NRCS cost for this project, was about almost $4 million. This protected over 77 people and 21 residences and 3 major roads and other major infrastructure downstream. This was a very great project. We're looking forward to the opportunity to see it. It was completed last year, but as soon as we can get out there, we are going to head to Wyoming and meet up with the great folks out there in the Dull Knife Johnson County area to see this project. So that was rehab. I told you it was going to be quicker. So we're going to get to questions, and we could probably go over more rehab, but it's a lot similar to what we did in watershed ops, so I was going to go quicker on that one. Now let's get into some EWP discussion. This is that third program that is not directly tied to the other two, but it is work in the watershed, and it is that recovery type work. It's that opportunity, and many of you get engaged in this program, and it functions a little bit differently because you're trying to provide recovery assistance in the middle of emergencies. And that's the big challenge there is you're in the middle of an emergency, you're trying to provide assistance to help local communities recover from a major disaster. And you're doing it pretty quickly there. So our sponsors, now remember I told you I was going to talk more about the sponsors later on. So here's that opportunity. For all three programs, a sponsor is basically the same type of a person. It's that state government agency. It's that local city unit of government. It could be a town, it could be a county or a parish organization, but it has to be one of those governmental organizations. It could be a municipal authority that falls up under a state type of jurisdiction or a local municipal jurisdiction. And it could be a tribal organization. It has to be some type of unit of local government though, whether it's that tribal organization, that municipal, the county, city, town, or state organization, some type of a local non-federal governmental type organization. It cannot be a private organization. It has to be one of those public government organizations. Eligible lands, private lands, non-federal public lands, and federal lands where there is a non-federal right of way, obviously a public use there, where it's non-federal lands. All right. All right. Had a freeze there. Sorry, my computer froze. Overview. So as an overview for this particular program, we provide local communities with assistance to recover from natural disasters such as floods, fire, drought, windstorm, earthquakes. We've even participated in volcano restoration a few years ago when they had the volcanoes in Hawaii. Any type of natural disaster that causes a sudden impairment in the watershed, we can participate with. It must reduce threats to life and property. We won't participate in any efforts that don't reduce threats to life and property. It has to be a reduction there. It must be economically, environmentally, and socially defensible. We have to be able to defend this. So the work has to meet cost benefit. It has to be environmentally beneficial. We provide CPA 52 forms and environmental assessments for, environmental EE statements for all of the work we do, evaluations. And then we classify the work as either exigencies or emergencies. Those exigency projects, ideally, the construction will be completed in 10 days. We can extend that some, and sometimes obviously it goes above that. But I would always encourage that those exigency projects be looked at as those more like temporary measures just to remove that imminent threat. We can always come back in later and do a full-blown emergency project with that 220-day time frame. But those exigencies need to be just what needs to be done today to immediately remove the hazard. Also, we've given authorities now for our states through our new revised policy as of January of this, actually November of last year, to be able to have the state conservationists can extend these projects without coming here in headquarters. So the exigencies, they could extend up to 90 days beyond the date of the event. And then they could extend the emergencies up to 18 months from the date of the event. And then recovery and floodplain easements. So the EWP program is broken down in two different portions. We're going to focus only on the recovery part today. We actually do not administer from the Watershed Program branch the easement side of the house. That's actually administered through a different division. So we actually work only on the recovery side here. We obviously participate with easements, but we don't administer that program out of our branch. All right, so the outline. Obviously, that disaster has to occur first to initiate a prompt need. When that disaster occurs, NRCS will conduct an assessment, a damage assessment. Normally, a electronic disaster report is developed. Sponsors will submit written applications for assistance to the state conservationists, and then it'll be a determination as to whether or not there is an exigency or an emergency. Damage survey reports are completed and approved. Sponsors are encouraged to work with NRCS on the completion of damage survey reports. That is a joint effort that needs a lot of local input. And we even encourage some of the federal partners to participate, like FEMA, and making sure that they are aware of some of the proposed measures. We recently entered into an MOU with FEMA. Well, the last one was 2018. And then in 2020, we supplemented that MOU with an interagency plan of operations. And that coordination plan and that plan of operations will allow us to work with FEMA to help our sponsors identify which federal agency is best suited to address these emergency disaster recovery opportunities that exist following a natural disaster. We don't want to create an environment where the sponsor has to go between both programs. We're trying to streamline it and make sure that the federal agencies can help you in making that determination which program will be most viable for you to participate in, whether it's the FEMA Public Assistance Program or if it's the NRCS EWP program. And then NRCS provides financial and technical assistance, the same as we do with any of these three watershed programs. So as a sponsor, there are certain responsibilities that the sponsor has. The sponsor is encouraged and responsible to participate on these local DSR teams. If a sponsor fails to do that, obviously your voice isn't as able to be captured and your input isn't able to be captured as much during that initial evaluation of this project. And then to secure land rights to prepare the work, that is always a sponsor responsibility. In obtaining permits, that is a sponsor responsibility. And any local cost share. And then administering local contracts is a responsibility of the sponsor to administer those local contracts. And then any necessary operation and maintenance, that is always a sponsor responsibility. And those 4 things are responsible, well, actually 5 things are responsibilities in any of the watershed programs. Sponsors are always responsible for land rights. Sponsors are always responsible for local permits, and sponsors are always responsible for their cost share, if it, as it exists. And then any local contracts, if you're going to do a sponsor-led, locally led contract, sponsors are always responsible for that. And then O&M. Federal cost share. So the standard cost share for this particular program is 75%, and the sponsor's cost share is 25%. In the event that a limited resource area is identified and you're working with one of those predetermined areas that meet the 3 criteria listed below, we will provide up to 90% cost share. So that criteria is that the housing values are less than 75% of the state average. The income is less than 75% of the state average, and the unemployment is twice the US average. If those 3 criteria are met, then that is what we classify as a limited resource area. We documented those and they're posted to our website. So they've already been predetermined for the year because you're looking at economic data that comes out in census data. So those areas have already been defined and they're posted to our website for the EWP program. So everyone can see that. But if you meet 2 of the 3, we will consider a waiver request where a request can be made that I meet 2 of the 3 and I'm almost meeting the 3rd one, but I don't quite meet it. And we'll consider a request for you to receive a waiver. You just have to submit that request in writing and document why you would be justifying a waiver and document that you do meet, in fact, 2 of the 3. And then we would reconsider that. All right, how do you apply? That 424 is encouraged. It's not always required, but it is encouraged, strongly encouraged you submit that 424. And some of the things that are documented, I stated here again. You can also submit that letter request. That's most likely what we'll see from sponsors is that letter request stating their knowledge and understanding of their responsibilities, their ability to meet their financial obligations and cost share, and their commitment to operation and maintaining the project and their local responsibilities, and definitely documenting their eligibility. One of the key things, though, that's always going to be required that we're kind of creating a new template to make sure that sponsors provide is that we do need sponsors to document that they've exhausted other resources. We just completed a great audit on this program. Sean Anderson, one of our members of the team, helped us lead us through a OIG audit. And one of the things identified there was that we, as an agency, needed to improve on documenting that sponsors have, in fact, exhausted other resources. That is a regulatory requirement in the rule that the sponsors do document that they have, in fact, exhausted other resources. So we sometimes we're not able to properly document that. So going forward, we're creating a new template letter that can help us better document that in the future, work with our sponsors. And then working with NRCS, we must have that DSR. So the sponsors helps to develop that DSR. It's required. We can't provide any funding without that DSR. And then once they're reviewed and approved, then funding is provided. So implementation, very similar to what I stated earlier on implementation. However, I will state that for exigencies, we are looking at that performance time of about 10 days. And I had stated earlier that now state conservations can extend that up to 90 days. And if an additional extension is needed, obviously you'd have to come to headquarters for the additional extension. But sponsors, you're able to work with state conservationists and extending an exigency 90 days. Now this is the kicker, from the date that the disaster occurred. That's critical. We're not saying 90 days from today, the date the agreement was signed. We're saying 90 days from the date that the exigency occurred. And the reason that is important is sponsors are given 60 days to submit a request. Then you're given 60 days to complete a DSR. Well, you're already 120 days out. If those time periods are not, closely followed, you may lose out on some of that opportunity to extend that project. So you really want to make sure that you don't wait the full 60 days to submit your request. You want to get that request in immediately so you don't lose that time. And then when completing the DSR, you want to have NRCS come out and you want to work with us to complete that DSR immediately. So that way you don't lose out on that time. And then the 18 months, you're same thing there.
So
Hey,
Kevin,
Ray, I see a
kind
question.
of a related question here, and it's pretty timely. How does a sponsor exhaust other resources if FEMA says NRCS is primary for the emergency watershed program issues?
So I think the question is getting at other federal resources, and we're not necessarily talking about federal resources, first of all, but even if we were, if you're not eligible for FEMA, that wouldn't be a resource right there that you would count. So I think I know what the person is getting at there. FEMA did not document that you were eligible, so you can't count that as another resource because that's not a resource you can actually tap into. What we're more so talking about though, so this is what I really want you to focus on. What we're more so talking about is if you have those local funds that you could use, we're really talking about that. Those local funds, some people have what they call rainy day funds. Some people have local funds that they use for disaster recovery in their local public works departments and other resources that they budgeted for these type of local disasters. If you don't have any local funding available that could help to provide for your share, sorry, for the recovery, not your share, for your recovery. Don't use the word share there. for the total recovery of this project, and you are out of funding that will be available for that purpose, then you would have exhausted all of your funding opportunities. We're not necessarily talking about other federal agencies because there shouldn't be another federal agency that is necessarily eligible for the same type of work normally. There may be some caveats where they are, but we're not promoting federal funds here. That's not what we're talking about in this particular instance. Was that the full of that question, or did it go any deeper, Ray?
No, I think that covered it. And state, is there a state nexus to that too, or were you including that in the local?
That's local. So state is considered non-federal is what I'm talking about. So that's a great qualifier there and clarifier. So if there are state funds that could be used, SRF funds or whatever, if there are any types of state funds that could be used for this type of disaster recovery, those are all considered local. So I'm not just talking about town and county. I'm talking about any funds that are available to that community from a non-federal agency. All of those funds, once they are exhausted, then that's when you're documenting that you do, in fact, have a need for federal assistance. That's what you're documenting.
Thanks for tapping on that one. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And I think I covered the emergency, the 220 days. So I'll keep moving there, but it's the same as the other one. You have to make sure that we're moving timely so that we can make sure that we actually are able to do that. This budgeting is very similar to what I stated before. So it's almost a repeat when you start looking at the budgeting there. One of the things to always remember in budgeting is you're always being reimbursed. So making sure that you have those funds up front so that you can be reimbursed, covered before the reimbursement gets there. All right, so here's a great success story. The folks in Harris County, Texas. Many of you remember the devastating flood, Hurricane Harvey, that hit Texas, and even during that same season, we had hurricanes hitting Puerto Rico and Florida and all over the Southeast, and it was very devastating. Where in this particular instance for Harris County, they were able to work with our state office in Texas, doing a great job with the Harris County Flood Control District to install some stream bank erosion and flooding protection measures to help to stabilize severely eroded canals and embankments throughout that area of Harris County. The total project cost for NRCS, this is just the NRCS cost, so this is the 75%, was about $2.1 million for the work that was done there. As a result of the work that they did there in Harris County, they were able to reduce the risk of flood for over 30 residences and structures and 1% of the floodplain, and then create an enhancement of the depth for more effective drainage. So basically restoring it back to its original capacity and its original function. So in order to more effectively drain in that area, as the capacity for drainage had been impacted as a result of this disaster. So that's a very good success story. So Ray, that is basically the extent of the presentation for the overview. And I think I finished about 10 minutes early in order for us to kind of get into some more time for question and answer, because I really want to do that more so than anything. I think that's what's going to benefit the folks most.
You bet. We're right on time, so that's excellent. Let me switch over. Let's have you stop sharing, and I'll put a screen up here, and we'll take a look at some of the questions that came in via registration, and then some that came in live that I didn't break in on. So we'll make sure that we are able to do both those. But grab that water, Kevin. My gosh, we just worked you the last few
That's
minutes.
all right.
Also, let the folks know in just a few minutes, we'll put them into a break then and come back to questions and answers as part of our feedback and our listening session. So just so folks kind of got a sense of what we're going to be doing there. So that's excellent. All right. Well, let's start with the first one here, Kevin, and I'm going to share my machine and we'll pull up these notes and take a few notes on the questions and whatnot. All right. Well, Kevin, you did a wonderful job. Look at all the ones that you answered. I did go ahead and put down the answers, and we're going to look to your written responses to these as the official. But I took a few notes for you and your staff so that at least you'd have, things like can it be used for deconstruction, 20% ag, that sort of thing. So just to let you know there. Let's tackle one of these registration questions first here. And how about any maintenance related issues popping up, toe drains, replacements, that sort of thing. And I know that you've got staff there. If you'll prompt them when it's time to have Jesse or Ralph, join us or Andrew.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll take a stab at it, and then Jesse or Ralph may want to chime in. But
Okay.
as these structures age, maintenance related issues do pop up all the time. Some of the most typical ones, one of the ones you identified, is the toe drains starting to become filled with sediment and other types of material. And then sometimes you'll even see corrosion and a need for repairing those toe drains. And then you'll start seeing issues maybe with maintenance. So the question states maintenance. I'm going to twist it a little bit. I'm going to stay with maintenance. So as you see structures age, you'll see need for more vegetative control and maintenance. So you'll see making sure that there's no woody debris and vegetative type of debris on the structure, and then maintain that cover, obviously. And then if you see areas where there's a lack of vegetation, there's potential for enhanced erosion. You want to address those types of things. So vegetative management. Then you'll see sometimes there are issues where you may see burrowing animals or things where you'll see obviously issues with those types of erosion type issues where they need to be addressed. So those are typical maintenance type things. You always want to exercise your valves, your stems, and all the appurtenances that go with the structure to make sure they're fully functioning and that you can, actually operate the tower and operate the risers and things of that nature when time comes for that. So you want to exercise those on a routine basis. So sometimes those types of issues come up during maintenance where you may need to make some adjustments or need to replace some things. Those are all maintenance. Mm-hmm. Now, there are those non-maintenance things that come up as well. And I kind of see a sense of some of that question coming up in this this question. Sometimes there are things that are not necessarily maintenance related that happens, and there is a need for repair. And some of those examples may be soil issues with the types of soils and the constructability of the structure. And a lot of those types of things that are non-maintenance that may come up. We've seen failures of risers and issues with corrosion and things like that, premature corrosion in structures. Sometimes when those things come up, we go back and we do an evaluation of the design and looking at the materials that were used and do an investigation, engineering investigation to determine if in fact there may have been some type of defect, whether it's a latent defect or some type of deficiency during design or construction that may have potentially caused some of these types of failures or types of issues that are non-maintenance. So we see a lot of maintenance related issues that come up that I mentioned earlier, but sometimes we see those non-maintenance issues, and we encourage our sponsors to work with us early on to notify us so that we can participate in a remedial project for those non-maintenance type issues that pop up that really show some level of degradation or deterioration, premature deterioration of the structure.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And let's move to the next question. I'm just going to highlight these, and it's on the screen for everyone to see. How do you prompt watershed districts to prepare financially for the long range upkeep? That seemed like kind of an important follow-up
Yeah.
to this one.
Yeah, that is critical. Being able to have a sponsor to be able to address the long-term financial responsibilities is vital to the success of what we just spent millions of dollars to install. So being able to have a sponsor do that, I think some of the most creative things that I've seen, Ray, as it relates to this is seeing that in some states there's been state level legislation that has gone forward to have included in the budget funding for sponsors to be able to provide some level of maintenance and funding some of the sponsors to be able to have a budget for some of these types of maintenance and upkeep and operation type of functions. Obviously, when the sponsor signs on, they're saying that they have that ability to leverage taxes and that, ability to have that authority to charge fees and things and to get some local fund. So you would expect that, in some regard that sponsors are able to do that and they are able to get those local resources from the users and the folks who benefit from these structures, whether it be through a tax levy or if it's through a fee usage. Sometimes those things happen and they do help to offset the cost of some of the needed operation and maintenance, and that has been successful. Then there are times when the state may just have a special program, a special set aside where there's state level funding to actually cover some of these types of things. So I would say between a state type of a revolving fund or state type of fund and then some type of special budget line item for the sponsor, if it's a state agency, and then between the local levying of taxes and fees, that's normally the best way to have that long range upkeep. As far as prompting the sponsor in the district, we make that known and upfront, and that's a discussion upfront as part of the engagement, the initial agreement and working with the sponsor. So that's all done upfront.
Okay. All right. Well, this one right here, I'm going to go to this one next. Do you foresee opportunities for increased funding for maintenance and rehabilitation for aging structures? It kind of relates to what you were just talking about.
So and I'm going to teeter totter along that word maintenance. So I don't foresee a increase of funding for maintenance. Maintenance is always the local responsibility of the sponsor. I think what this person may be getting at though is for those repairs. I think that's what they're probably getting at. And when you have those repairs that are non-maintenance related, when you have those repairs that are needed to address interim measures that would help to increase and improve the usability of a structure, I do foresee that there may be some interest in an opportunity possibly for us as an agency to participate with our local sponsor to address some of those non-maintenance related repairs. Now, I do want to kind of stray away from the word rehabilitation because rehabilitation never covers maintenance and rehabilitation never covers repairs. A rehabilitation is actually rehabilitation. It is taking a structure to upgrade it to meet those state and local and federal dam safety requirements, and then also helping to extend the service life. Now, that's what we're always going to be focused on for rehabilitation. So that's what that is. If you start looking at repairs, that's more like a watershed ops, quasi remedial type of effort, And if we're going in that direction, I think there's opportunities there for us as an agency to provide funding in the future, provided that there's the right opportunity for maybe an opportunity for repairing some of these types of structures, but not rehabilitating to cover and address maintenance. I think we're more so looking at those repairs that are non-remedial, that maybe those interim measures that will help improve the usability of a structure that has been experienced some deficiencies over time.
Okay, very good. Let's go to a couple of the live questions that came up. And one of them is kind of related to this. And this individual related to us that they're curious about projections for future funding as projects transition from the assessment to the rehabilitation planning phases to the design and the construction phases. And his particular experience, this participant, is local sponsors will often be the rate limiting participants, local conservancy districts in particular, and underfunded. And I think a lot of our local sponsors could claim the same thing, huh?
Yeah, I've seen that. So this is specific to rehab, and I will communicate to you that we have been in communications with folks to and ask questions, and even answer questions on the viability of the 35%, that local cost share for their rehab program. And I do understand that there is that does inhibit sometimes the ability for us to move forward with the program. Now, obviously, some states have moved well beyond that and are able to actually meet that 35%, and it is not a problem. But for those communities where it isn't, I think that there is interest and there's public interest in seeing if there's a way to change that. Obviously, that's not something that NRCS can do, but if that's something that legislatively Congress goes in and changes and removes that requirement for that 35% cost share, obviously we as an agency would support any authorizations and appropriations that support a reduced local share and an enhanced federal share. So we're not in any way opposed to it. And we would support anything that comes out requiring an enhancement of the federal share. Now, obviously, that comes with a risk because as that federal cost share goes up, that means there's more federal funds that are needed to complete the project, and that's going to reduce how those funds can be dispersed for other projects. So, all those are things that come into play. But we have had to answer questions related to that and have had to provide, guidance and effects on how that may happen. And I see my friend, Dr. Siebert. He may have some better insight and some additional insight on what they're doing outside of us.
How about it, Dan? You want to do that?
Yeah, I think you did a good job answering that, Kevin. I think maybe in reading the question, you might want to speak to the cost share it says 30% cost share for construction. First of all, being, I think the percentage is 35, and NRCS can pay 100% of construction. The 35% is total rehab project cost. So you want to talk about that or clarify that a little bit?
Yes. So I assume that and you're right. It is 35%. And I assume that they were kind of looking across the board because they were maybe thinking about that 35%. But, it is correct. We can pay up to 100% construction costs, but we cannot exceed that. And we cannot exceed the 65% cost share on the total project cost. So if you elect to say, all right, I will just do the 100% construction cost because I can help do some in-kind services or whatever to kind of cover some of the design and the planning effort. And I'm more likely to be able to use some local resources to meet some of my 35% there and not actually have to lay out fiscal dollars to do that. I'm more so able to do that versus having to go contract for someone to pay for 35% of a construction project. That's totally fine. And then we'll just pay 100% of the up to 100% of the construction cost because you've already met your 35% somewhere else. Now, when you start thinking about it though, 35% of the construction is not very likely you're going to immediately meet that through planning and design, most likely, unless you're doing all the planning and all the design. So, there's still going to be some local share. So, but Dan is exactly right. We can pay up to 100% for construction, provided that we don't exceed that 65% of the total construction cost total project cost, total project cost in other phases of the project. And we're only looking at those eligible total project costs, not those fees and permits and things that are already your responsibility as a sponsor. Those things would be included.
Must be under 65% total, right?
Yes, of the total eligible rehabilitation project cost. And those eligible costs of those does not include those local costs.
Okay. A couple of quick ones before we take a break. And these came in during, and then we're going to get to some of the others that came in through the registration. So stay with us, folks. You don't want to miss any of this. How about detailed information state by state on watershed dams that have already been assessed? Is there any such thing out there?
So we do have all of the assessments available, and we will provide them to both the sponsor and our state conservationists. Well, I mean, we get them from the sponsor and the state con. So they're available and the sponsor has them. We would not provide an assessment to the general public about a dam. We would only give that to the sponsor. So it's the sponsor's responsibility to provide that anywhere beyond that, because that is how it's, so it's not going to be shown on a website anywhere, because there is specific information that is related to that dam. So we wouldn't put that out on the website.
Follow the appropriate federal requirements for what's released and what isn't to whom.
Exactly.
Okay.
But once we give that to the sponsor, it is in their purview to share that as they deem.
Sponsors can ask for that. Yeah. Okay.
Well, they actually have it. So every sponsor has their assessment.
Okay.
They will have it. If they don't, definitely check with your state office, because you should have a copy of that.
Let's see. NRCS state offices also. Yeah. Okay. How about how many of the 169 rehabilitated dams were decommissioned?
We've only decommissioned 2 that I'm aware of, and I'm saying that I'm aware of because I don't want to talk off the top of my head and get the number wrong. But I
Yeah,
believe it's only been 2. I visited one, and I know the other one because I was there when we actually did the investigation report. I was actually working in the field, so I'm only aware of 2 that we decommissioned. And Jesse is on. And Jesse, if you want to chime in, because Jesse's going to know the exact answer to that. If you want to chime in, feel free to.
Sure. Since I've been in headquarters, I've only known one that has been decommissioned. I'll have to get with you later on what the other one was, but very few.
Yeah, and the one you're talking about is the one that I was probably a field engineer working on, state construction engineer working on. That's that one.
Correct.
And then there was one prior to that that I'm aware of that I visited in another state. So that's where I'm getting the 2 from. So I think we're on the same page.
very close, huh? All right.
Mhm.
Boy, you guys need a break today, just like that old McDonald's commercial. You deserve a break today. That's what, no one will know it, but anyway, just to let folks know too, we've got your registration questions to you here. I want to make sure that we've got them, and we're going to be talking about these as we go along. High hazard dams and several other things we've got going on here. We're going to be tackling these during the first part of our second half of the webinar. And this is really a listening session and a questions and answers. One of the questions we had is, what are the questions that you still have after the presentation? So we'll go through that. And if there is duplication, Kevin and Ralph and Jesse, sometimes that's good with duplication with purpose, right? That we have the opportunity to kind of do that. So we've got some of the questions. All of the questions will be responded by in writing, and as a follow up to the session. So don't despair if we don't get to your question as quickly as you wanted. We're still going to get to them. Welcome back, folks, and let's do a mic check. Make sure that our panelists are all back with us.
Hey, Ray.
Kevin, hey Dan.
All right.
Hey Kevin.
Hello.
All set and ready to go? Okay.
Yes.
Good. Very good. Let's take off on the next set of questions. These came in from registrations, Kevin, and tried my best to kind of bring some of them together that kind of matched, right? Again, we're looking for, this is by way of feedback, right? Part of our listening session is to answer more questions. And so we're going to do that for a while. And then we're going to invite the participants also to give their number 1 recommendation that they feel like would really help us after they hear some of these answers. So how about this one? Do you have instances of folks that building below high hazard dams? And if so, how do you advise them to work on that?
Yes. So, when you use the word high hazard dam, you anticipate that there's some level of development or structure or residences or infrastructure below it already. So, that's what we would anticipate for a high hazard dam. But when I see that question, I also think that there's a discussion maybe of building below low and significant hazard structures that then prompts or facilitates the need for a hazard class change to having a high hazard structure. Obviously, what we would encourage is that our local sponsors and local communities, not just a sponsor, but our local communities, work with developers and discourage any major development downstream of a structure, and that there's proper easements in place to make sure that a structure would not be ineffective and that we wouldn't have to have that hazard class change. But in the event that we do identify or notice those developments, we would encourage that local sponsor to immediately notify us. Now, NRCS is doing our routine inspections, whether it's 1 or 5 years, and we're normally going to be made known of some of these things. Every 5 years, at least at a minimum, we're going to go in and evaluate all those downstream and some of those upstream hazards, but definitely those downstream hazards, to determine if there's a need for those hazard classification changes, and we would make adjustments accordingly. So we want to catch those things, but we don't want to necessarily wait 5 years. We want to know right away. So how we handle it, we would ask and encourage that sponsors make us aware and help us to know if there are any plans for development, not just if there is a development, but if there's plans for development. And then if there is a development, obviously, if there's structures downstream, you definitely want to alert us as those structures are going up, so we can make appropriate course of action is a decision on what's next. It may be a decision to rehabilitate the structure so that it is a high hazard structure and that it can actually protect those downstream values. And then if there's an upstream, another question was about downstream. But if there's upstream development, even, that's a concern too. We want to make sure we have proper easements in place and proper land rights to make sure that we reduce or discourage any upstream development, because, we have that flood pool area that we want to make sure that it's functioning. And, when folks build in the flood pool, that's not ideal. So we want to make sure we also protect those upstream easements where it may seem like there's no water and hasn't been water for 10 years. But when the structure functions, you may very well be finding yourself below the 100-year floodplain elevation and flood pool elevation. That could be an issue. So early notices and communication to NRCS so that we can work to make sure there's proper zoning and easements and coordination on the development. That's what I would encourage, Ray.
Thanks so much. Kevin, let's go. And you did get a drink of water, I assume, and you're
yes,
ready to go for the
yes.
local call.
If I sound any lower, let me know, and I'll try to ramp it up a little bit.
About 90.
I have water, and I should be ready to go.
Oh, good. So how about, have any dam rehabilitation projects already been authorized and are waiting for funding allocation at present? Let's work on this one right
Yeah. So now we do have projects that have been authorized, but are not necessarily waiting on funding allocation. And I'm going to come back to that statement, but for now, I'm going to say firmly, not any waiting on. So what I mean by that is when we had all of our requests be submitted for funding, we didn't turn back any requests for authorized projects to be designed or constructed. So that's what I mean. Now, there are projects that have been authorized that have not requested funding. And that's where we want to actually encourage and work with the local communities to encourage that we move those projects forwards into implementation. So funding is available, and we want to do that. We recently have received some requests for additional funding that we haven't been able to meet just yet. So we're dealing with that, but we do anticipate being able to address those needs in short order. But we haven't had an issue where we've had to wait list any implementation of a rehab project that has been authorized.
No wait listing. All right. Good news, huh? To date, huh? Again, I'm taking a few notes. These aren't the official notes. They're just easel notes to keep me in the game and make sure that you guys have, that the staff has these for when you actually write your written ones. Well, let's move to this question, shall we? How about the reimbursement to sponsors for costs incurred for required mitigation projects prior to the project agreement for construction?
So there are sometimes mitigation costs that may be reimbursed, but broadly, most mitigation costs are not reimbursed, especially if it's some type of mitigation associated with land rights and things of that nature. So in the event there is a cost determined that can be reimbursed, and it happens prior to a agreement, ideally that is not the thing that we would want to see, is that there be costs incurred prior to agreement. So we encourage that sponsors work with us and we have an agreement in place before any costs are going to be reimbursed are incurred. So that's the first thing. But in the event there are costs that are incurred that NRCS would have paid for, there is a documentation process that they can go through to go back and get reimbursed. It is arduous, it is time consuming, it does take a lot of documentation, but so that's why we're discouraging any type of pre-award cost be incurred. The best thing is that you work with us, we work through the plan of work, we work through the schedule, and we make sure that everything is done at its appropriate time, and no work really should start before that agreement is put in place.
Via the agreement then. Okay. Get the agreement going, then start working it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Per agreement. All right. Good. Good stuff. All right. How about, our floodplain restoration projects not eligible for the Public Law 566 funding? And you've covered three, just to remind folks, you've covered three different programs. So that will expand this a little bit with and say, all right, Are floodplain restoration projects not eligible?
So I think mostly what people are probably looking at here is the watershed operations program, I would assume.
Okay.
And so I would say for that particular program, yes, we do floodplain restoration projects. I've done a few, and I know other states where we've done some. So, you know, that program is fairly nimble, and we could do floodplain restoration projects under the PL566 authority through the watershed operations program. We
Okay.
can also do them through the EWP program, as I mentioned earlier as well. So you have two options there, but it's very viable.
Well, we're just rocketing through here. I can't hardly type as quickly as you can answer these.
That's okay.
We're giving
No
it a
worries.
try. We'll give it a try here. Who controls the rights to a use of a watershed impound?
So land rights, as I mentioned, are the sponsor's responsibility.
Mhm.
So when a sponsor acquires those land rights, it may stipulate that they have access. You know, there may be an access easement. Obviously, they have to be able to maintain and operate the structure. And then the impoundment, there's the flood pool area that they'll have land rights for the flood pool area. So that would include the impoundment. So the sponsor would have all of those land rights. Now, as part of it, though, the sponsor may provide or allow for some level of public access for whether it be for recreation. Obviously, we have structures where folks, you know, may fish in and may do boating and other recreational type of activities, trails or whatever. So there may be access for those types of recreational purposes. And then if the structure is, you know, owned primarily a landowner's property, primarily their property, then obviously that landowner would have levels of access, but that access would not grant them the ability to go in and manipulate or operate the structure in any way that violates our O&M agreement with that sponsor. So the sponsor has primary access and rights to control the structure and the impoundment, but the folks in the community may have access to enjoy it and to take advantage of the benefits of it.
Okay. Wow. Quite a distinction there, isn't there?
Yes.
This one. Can you speak to the cost share public 566 non-flood projects, limited resource areas for PL 566, and that sort of thing? Let's go to this one right here.
So yeah, so that's a good question. I think I know exactly what they're getting at there. So
Mhm.
there are opportunities there, as I mentioned, under the PL566 authority. And when you look at the watershed operations program, we can basically match the same type of assistance provided by any other program. So when you start talking about those limited resource areas, many of our programs may allow for that 90% cost share for limited resource communities. And then, you know, you have those socially disadvantaged communities, even where we have an enhanced cost share rate. And we would honor those same cost shares as we would with another program, whether it be EQIP or some other farm bill type program. So we would not require a higher level of local cost than another program would. One of the ways, the second question was, you know, where can we find the areas that qualify? So the immediate areas that we define for the purpose of watershed programs are those areas that are defined on the map that I had mentioned earlier on our EWP website. That's where we keep it. It's because those are the watersheds and the communities that have been defined as limited resource for that particular program that meets that. For other watershed programs, we're meeting those same limited resource definitions for those communities. And that map is posted to that website under our watershed programs branch. But beyond that, though, I think it's important to note that if there are other communities that would, or other groups or individuals that would meet that limited resource or whatever social disadvantage or other criteria that would receive a higher cost share rate in a different NRCS program or USDA program, we would then have to honor that same type of a cost. Well, I shouldn't say have to. We're allowed to honor that same type of cost share and provide them the same level of cost share, whether it be 90% or whatever it would be for enhancement based on that other program's authority. So we would provide that same level.
Excellent.
There is not a map that I have for that, though.
Excellent. Very good.
And I have had instances where that has happened in recent projects, and we just documented where it was provided and we matched the cost. That's what we did.
Okay. We did have some pieces in here that came in. All right. I'm going to go back to the ones that came in from don't look at the screen here for a bit.
Okay, I won't.
From our discussions, yeah.
Okay.
Let's go to this one right here. Can changes in hydrology due to climate change that may impact structure be part of a rehabilitation project?
So what we've talked about and defined is that when there are changes in the land use and
Mhm.
changes within the watershed.
Mhm.
So in the event that there are not necessarily, we wouldn't necessarily document climate changes, but what we're documenting is that we know for a fact that if we did an analysis and the runoff because of upstream developments has enhanced runoff in the watershed. And obviously, if you analyze it now, it may be taken into fact some considerations for new hydrology principles that would account for climate change possibly. So depending on how you analyze it, it may account for some of that. But it will be facilitated though. I think and that's what's important to know. The changes would be facilitated by land use changes and developments and changes in the watershed, not primarily climate change. Now, I will say that though we've done a lot of work now, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's been renewed interest in some of the impacts. So I would not doubt or can't say that we wouldn't necessarily start evaluating some of those potential climate change impacts. I can't say yeah or nay that that may not play a part in the future. But what I will say emphatically now is that what we've always done is looked at land use changes. And I think that's the critical word. And
Okay.
in evaluating some of those impacts of the land use changes, there may be some level of hydrology analysis that accounts for the potential impacts of climate change as
Mhm.
part of your analysis, but it would not have been previously facilitated that way. And obviously, like I said, going forward, we may start looking at other opportunities and other analysis that would account for that. Now, there are our folks from the technical side of the house as an S&T who are probably participating and will be able to provide us some additional information on that, and we can provide an additional written response as well into some additional information on it. So look out for some additional written responses, information in the written response.
The school, the opportunity may be there. It's just not hasn't been necessarily capitalized on yet, right?
Well, I think the take-home point is that that didn't facilitate the changes in hydrology due to climate change.
Yeah.
Didn't necessarily facilitate the need for rehabilitation. The facilitation was the land use changes. It's been the motive. What we've always looked at. There were land use changes in the watershed that facilitated or prompted a need for rehabilitation analysis, and that analysis could have included some level of climate impacts.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to drive home is
Okay.
it was facilitated by land use changes. Yeah.
You're kind of on a run here. Let's go with this one then. For rehabilitation hydrology, is evaluated so that the rehabilitated dam will meet its hazard classification. That hydrologic evaluation may include climate change considerations, huh? So,
It's a similar question. I think, for that one, I would probably just work with our folks in S&T to give a good solid answer on that. That kind of speaks to how we're addressing some of these opportunities now as it relates to climate change and given some consideration of some of the most recent things that have been taking place. I think it'd be best that we just give an answer based on some of the most recent opportunities that are out there, because these things are new and not new from the standpoint of, we just started this conversation, but I think there's been a renewed conversation. Here's a recent that we would benefit from collectively providing some feedback to all in a written response to that. So I think that would be better.
S&P, huh? Mm-hmm.
S&T, our folks in science and technology.
Oh,
It's just a part of NRCS. I'm sorry.
yeah. No, that's all right.
I'm using too many acronyms, aren't I?
Yeah. Okay. For written response.
Yeah.
All right. So
Yeah. So we'll partner and give a specific written response on that one.
okay. So this is one that came in from our discussions here that we've had, and the participants are still sending us some nice notes back in. Do you consider debris removal part of exigency actions that you would fund?
Yeah, so short answer is yes. We do that all the time. where debris removal is included as an exigency type of a practice. Many times it can be completed pretty quickly there, and it would be a good type of practice for an exigency classification. But yes, we would consider that to be eligible for an exigency.
Excellent. Can you speak about the cost share for the Public Law 566 projects regarding providing 90% of the limited resource areas? Where
I think we kind of covered that one a little bit. So that was what we were talking about earlier. And it's going to be the same response basically, where, you know, we're able to meet those same cost share rates as other programs. And we define what those limited resource areas are. They are on the website. And then anything beyond that, we are matching basically the authorities that other USDA programs would offer to communities who are eligible for those higher cost share rates. We would match those same authorities or rates, I should say.
Perfect.
Not authorities, rates.
All right. Okay. Let's go to
Yeah,
that.
if that isn't quite clear enough, you know, we could always, you know, ask the folks to kind of, once we give these written responses, maybe somehow chime in again, and, you know, but I think, you know, I'm hitting what they're asking for on that one.
Very good. Okay. I'm going to go back down here and start grabbing those ones from the registrations to honor all those that came in with some of the registrations. So rest your mind just a bit here while I dive down here and find some of these. You've answered these. I think our next one is this one right here. Can the PL566 help out to build out a dispersed flood mitigation program on hundreds of private properties?
So I'm assuming that this question is intended to say that we're doing flood mitigation across many properties and areas, and the goal is always for the PL566 program to do a watershed project that benefits multiple landowners, and not one single landowner, but multiple individuals and the broader community of that watershed. So it is our goal that any flood mitigation type work that we would do would provide assistance and benefits to multiple, whether it's hundreds, but multiple properties and individuals. That is the goal. There may be more that person may want are getting at in that question, but from the standpoint of the way I'm seeing it is, you know, that flood mitigation, those measures that we propose would be to address and could potentially benefit and provide protection for private properties across a given watershed. Now, obviously, the entire plan may have to include multiple measures. If you're talking about hundreds of private properties, it may have to have multiple measures to address mitigation for hundreds of properties, depending on what's going on. I mean, we put in bypass channels and things of that nature, diversion type structures that may benefit, you know, numbers of properties, you know, 20s or 30s or whatever, you know, multiples of 10s. But when you start getting into hundreds of private properties, you know, 1 or 2 dams may not do that, and it may take series of structures to do that, but that would still fit within a normal plan. So yes, we would be able to do that.
Excellent. How about the watershed program consider infrastructure in the administration's new infrastructure plan?
So when you look at what we do, a lot of the watershed programs, all three are dealing with infrastructure. And the watershed operations program is primarily dealing with new infrastructure. The watershed rehabilitation program is primarily dealing with upgrading existing infrastructure. EWP is primarily focused on protecting infrastructure. So when you look at it from the standpoint of what the program's goals are, it's obviously involving infrastructure. That's what we're doing. Now, I cannot in any way speak to what the president's you know, infrastructure plan will include, and whether or not those programs will be included in it. You know, I can't. I have no way of saying yeah and nay on that. You know, but I would just say that, you know, our programs deal with infrastructure, and because they deal with infrastructure, you know, we would expect that some level of infrastructure engagement or opportunity would be there. But we would just have to actually wait and see what, you know, what is actually included, and if it will capture those programs. I think we're a viable option. Yeah, if that's the question. I think we're a good viable option. I can't say yeah or nay if it's going to be included though.
Hopefully I got that right. Uncertain of administration plans to include our programs, huh? At this
Yes.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We just don't know, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good, valuable opportunity, but we don't know.
Yeah. All right. What we doing there? You doing all right? Grab a water there.
I'm good. I'm overhydrated.
Okay. Oh, that's
No,
we'll have to give you
I'm
a
good for now.
10-minute break. I noticed I started the timer a little bit late on our 10-minute break, all for our advantage, I guess.
That's okay.
Yeah. Let's move to this one. Has there been any updated app updates to the
Yeah.
application process? Yeah.
Yeah, so we have made some updates. I think the biggest update that's of importance and significance is that we have moved towards more of a rolling process for all of the programs. Now, EWP has always been that way. We didn't have an application period for EWP because you can't. But for the other programs, ops and rehab, we've normally had like an application window or period of applications when we accepted them. We're gradually moving away from that. We do want to have a scheduled or structured way of taking applications still. But what we're more so focused on now is providing an open opportunity for sponsors to work with the states in submitting applications and requests for assistance at any time. And then we can take and process those at any time. And funding, if funding is available, we can address them at any time. Now, obviously, we do need to be considerate in the way we distribute funding and the way we actually make this funding decisions. So there's a methodology that we've developed behind that. And we're actually in the process of releasing that new information on how that new methodology will work. For rehab, we already set a timeline up for fund requests that were due this coming June. So that was already in place, and we just stuck with that. And we actually do not have any additional rehab funding for this year to allocate or request beyond additional funds. We don't have any new requests. So we're not really doing anything new anyway with rehab until we get all those fiscal year 22 requests in. But after that fiscal year 22 cycle, we may go to more of a rolling and revolving open door for requests. For operations, on the other hand, we had always opened the door up, or at least in the last 3 years, for remedial requests to be all the time. There's no need to hold up on a remedial request. If the engineering investigation report has been completed, it's been concurred by CED, and you have everything ready to go, we need to address remedial right away. So if there's funds available, we need to address it. Preliminary investigation feasibility report, same thing. If there's a need to do it, we want to address it right away. Planning updates and feasibility reports for planning feasibility, reaffirming feasibility, those have always been on the go. So all of that stuff has already been, let's do it now. Let's not have a specific deadline for those. Let's just do it. So we've received those requests. Now what we're doing is we're saying that even for going forward for those new requests for planning and those new requests for design and construction, because things are starting to get completed more quickly now and things are becoming ready for additional funding phases, then what we're starting to do now is actually opening the door up for us to be able to go in and accept those requests on an ongoing basis. Now, obviously, when we get to the point of having a reduction in the amount of funds available, and we start having those larger requests coming in for construction and design, we do need to have some thought behind the process of awarding funding for construction projects. And, you could have 5 or 6 construction projects take up all the money, and then you do no planning and design for the year. So there's obviously a methodology behind that of making sure that we don't release all the funding for just construction projects and then have nothing in the pipeline to keep us going. So there'll be reserves set up and thresholds set up also, that once we reach that certain threshold for that phase, we wouldn't want to exceed that. So a succinct answer, yes, we've changed and updated the process for application as it relates to timing and the ability to request funding. And we've also required that PIFR be provided. And I went through some of the slides on all the information that's required to be provided for the application going forward.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Let's run to the next question, and we've still got some questions coming in and some chats going on, and we'll get caught up with those too as we go along here. What are the priorities and anticipated changes to and I think this could apply to several programs, all 3 programs, and you covered some of this. So any reinforcement you want to give at this point on priorities or anticipated changes?
I really like that question because that's what we want to really focus on and hone in on. when it comes to working with our sponsors and everyone involved, our number one priority is implementation.
Yeah.
You know, how do we get these projects that Congress has provided funding to us for completed? You know, our goal isn't just to plan things. Our goal isn't just to design things, but we want to ultimately construct things and get construction completed. So in order to do that, we want to work with our sponsors and our local everyone to enhance and increase the implementation rates so that we can get things built quicker. Other priorities include streamlining the programs in such a way that we can reduce any inefficiencies that we find. And there are inefficiencies that we find, and there's opportunities for making things quicker and reducing the amount of time or the amount of resources necessary to complete any of the phases or complete any of the processes. Then we want to streamline those efforts and make sure we take advantage of technologies that are available to actually make things quicker. We have to realize that we, you know, have a smaller workforce as it relates to dedicated staff for this particular these particular suite of programs. So we have to leverage the abilities of outside partners and leveraging the abilities of sponsors and A&E firms. So we want to do that. We want to leverage other abilities and other capabilities that we have outside of just NRCS staff. And to that end, I think what we've done is provided resources and make sure we had the financial resources available to help our local sponsors to participate at the levels that they can and take the lead where they can in certain phases of the project. Now, it always requires, you know, we're not going to say that we're not going to ever require NRCS oversight and NRCS concurrence and approval at certain stages that, you know, are required. That's always going to happen. But at the same time, I think one of the good things that we're, you know, to know is that we want sponsor engagement and sponsor participation and to increase our ability to support our sponsors in leading up any efforts necessary throughout the phases of these projects, as long as we can increase the implementation rates and get there faster. You know, if you know, if changing over requires or slows up the process, I would suggest we need to rethink that. You know, we really want to get to quicker implementation.
Thanks, Kevin. How about this one? How can the Bureau of Indian Affairs partner with NRCS regarding this program on behalf of our tribal nations? And
Yeah,
how do
so
the tribes apply?
yeah, over the last, I would say 3 years or so, we've kind of been engaged with BIA, and I've even done some personal trainings at different meetings and tribal conferences. And I would suggest that the one thing is that we can have BIA help us with outreach and communication of what these programs are and how NRCS can help tribal organizations and tribal communities. I think that there's a great opportunity there that some folks may not necessarily know the benefits there. And I think there's an opportunity there for BIA to help communicate that, as well as others. I mean, there may be other organizations too. But I think another thing is that, you know, many times there's the Integrated Resource Management Plan, IRMP. And the IRMP includes a lot of the same content and analysis that we would include in our watershed operations plans, our watershed plans. So I think helping to define a nexus and a connection and comparison of where those two different documents are similar and seeing how we can transition from the IRMP to the watershed plan so that we can actually have tribal organizations to participate in the watershed program is a big win. You know, so if there are those existing IRMPs or if there is, you know, there are organizations participating in the development of them, I would suggest that we can look at opportunities to show how those can actually be converted over to a watershed plan in the event that there's a need or a desire to participate in watershed operations so that those can be authorized.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Great opportunities for partnering all along. And I'm often reminded that the Regional Conservation Partnership Program of the NRCS is also an opportunity to start that partnering process, maybe on a smaller scale, and then build from that to a Public Law 566 project or a watershed operations project.
Yeah, that's a great opportunity to kind of bring in those multiple partners. And sometimes there are PL566 like projects that are actually being done through RCPP. So that's just another avenue to do similar type work. We don't want to, you know, create a duplicative effort or, you know, but there are similar opportunities there. So yeah, I think that's a great opportunity for partnership.
So staying with the registration questions here for a bit, and can we expect a watershed and flood prevention operations program fiscal year 21 funding announcement?
So we did the announcement already for fiscal year 21. I'm assuming that person probably meant the fiscal year 22 announcement, maybe.
Okay.
So that announcement is forthcoming. And as I mentioned, we're mostly going to focus on the rolling, announcement period, where we're going to start now allowing states to just submit rolling ongoing requests. And as funds are available, we continue to move forward so that we're not waiting to another funding cycle or another appropriation. As long as funds are available, we keep moving.
The next question that I see here, Kevin, I think you might have answered during the course of our discussion, but anything you want to reemphasize there? Status of the fiscal year 22 appropriation?
Yeah, I think we covered it best in that slide that was in the presentation. We received 250 million for watershed ops and 10 million for rehab. We've obligated upwards of, I think it's over 160 or 70 million in ops, and then pretty much all the rehab has been obligated. So, I think that slide did the best justice of it, and it's basically that update was actually provided in the presentation. Yeah.
Excellent, very good. Thanks for doing that. What about the anticipated funding level? I guess that's also covered in the slide that you did.
Well, I didn't project, so I would say that if you look at that slide, Ray, what they would see is a trend, and the trend has been that watershed ops has over the last 3 years received about $250 million. And then the trend for rehab has been about 10 million. And then the trend over 3-year average for EWP is about 70 million. But obviously, there were years where there were zeros, and then there were years where there were larger sums. So you can't really, say. So I would say that with that rehab trend of 10 million, that's probably what you would expect, is that the trend would kind of continue in that same way, that 250, the 10, and then some level of EWP supplemental funding.
And the last one you gave me was
EWP is about, it's about 70 million on average over the course of 3 years. But normally a supplemental appropriation will be well in excess of $100 million. So it's hard to predict or anticipate what will be the next supplement for a disaster recovery. But the average trend has been 70 million if you count if you look at the last 3 years.
Okay, good. How about prediction for when the monies will be available and what they can be used for?
So that's similar to every year. The monies for ops and rehab will become available in October. So in any funds that are in operations now, we can immediately carry over, provided there's no rescission or anything. So those funds are made available, we can immediately carry those over, and then those funds will be used immediately in October for any requests that came in. And if we see requests that come in, as soon as we do the announcement next month, if there's requests that come in, obviously once we've ranked all of them and go through it, we could honor those requests. So when are they available? Definitely in October, we'll start seeing some level of funding. Obviously, that level of funding is dependent on whether or not we have a full appropriation or a supplemental appropriation. I'm not a supplement, excuse me, but a CR. So there's a continuing resolution and there's a smaller appropriation, we may only get a percentage of that funding. But as funds become available, we will generally put them out. I will say this to that person: we normally notice that it could go as far as March before funds are fully available. But we hope that isn't the case. That affects mostly rehab because it's such a smaller pot. But for operations, we would like to hope that those funds start trickling in well in advance of March.
Okay. How about the future role of NRCS in the watershed programs going forward?
So our role is basically going to be somewhat the same, I'd say, as far as us working with our local partners and partnering to make sure that we provide that technical leadership necessary to advance these projects through planning, design, and construction. I see our role also as helping to, like I said, streamline it and improve on any opportunities for the program to make sure that we can better deliver a program that benefits our sponsors. I see one of our roles though is in helping to do more training and outreach. That's probably a role that we have to really take on a lot more than we have in the last few years. And that is to make sure that we outreach to all the customers out there that can potentially be involved, and making sure we reach underserved customers as well, to make sure that the program is broadly and effectively providing assistance across the board. And then also I see us as being there to look at other ways we can learn from what some other federal agencies have done, maybe modernize our programs in any way we can. So, leveraging some of the experiences and the technologies and the expertise gained from others, to say, let's rebuild our programs, rebrand them in such a way that they are beyond the 21st century. And now we're well into the 21st century. So to make sure that they actually meet the most current technologies and are relevant, most relevant, I should say.
How about what support does the NRCS state engineer and other NRCS staff provide to watershed districts?
Yeah, so the NRCS state engineering, especially the engineering staff as a whole, is critical in all aspects of watershed PL566 program implementation, and some of the program management and planning. So I would say specifically when you start talking about the engineering though, if you have structures in place, obviously as you look at the opportunity for doing evaluations of the structures and getting that technical assistance on those existing structures and doing engineering investigations and inspections, that engineering expertise that we have is critical to being able to successfully help those sponsors that we have in being able to do their routine inspections and then to repair. I remember we partnered a lot when I was in the States with working with our sponsors to provide designs and technical assistance to repair those O&M type issues that the sponsor would identify. And I think that's a critical role. But yeah, just providing that technical leadership and helping the sponsors to get these projects moving and continuing to operate safely. So technical leadership, yeah.
So a related question, why can't NRCS accept engineering and approvals of the OSM as an acronym I'm not familiar with? OSM would be?
I'm not familiar with OSM either. So I can answer the question without knowing what OSM means, and it may not be the full answer.
Kevin, and I think it's the Office of Surface Mining.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Oh, thank you, Ralph. Ralph, are you familiar with the instance here, or I think
if it is OSM that I'm thinking about, I would assume it'd be like for a ramp type project where we're rule abandoned mine type efforts. We have done PL566 in the past.
Yeah, okay. So I think what this person is probably getting at then is maybe there was some engineering work done by an outside source. In order for it to be, we have to make sure that everything meets NRCS standards. And, so NRCS has the technical lead when it comes to engineering assistance. So, we can maybe work with others, but it doesn't mean that we wouldn't be able to work with others to accept the work that OSM and others have done for as an engineering design, but they would have to meet our standards and specifications. So I don't know where we wouldn't work with them. Now, approval, we would not designate approval by another organization. So, that wouldn't be delegated out because they wouldn't be a technical service provider able of approving any of the work. So I think that's probably what that person may be getting to. And if we didn't fully answer your question, you can feel free to clarify the question a little bit. But NRCS retains that technical responsibility for leading up engineering services, and we wouldn't readily yield that responsibility over to another entity unless they are a certified technical service provider or someone of that nature.
The other engineering question I found from the registration materials was this one: how have the regional ID and IQ engineering contracts been working? And what will be the structure of the next round of IDIQs? And I suppose we ought to define what IDIQ is and for the participants.
Yeah, so an IDIQ is a term for a federal contracting vehicle. It's an indefinite delivery, an indefinite quantity contract. So it allows us to contract with A&E firms to deliver. We have a statement of qualifications and work to be done, and then from that, we'll develop task orders against this larger contract that will be specified and it'll put some definition to the delivery and the quantity of things that we're doing over the time. And normally it's like a 5-year, 4 option years of a contract.
Mhm.
And those entities can then deliver those products to us over the course of that time based on those task orders that we issue against that contract.
Mhm.
So it has been working well. I think there are opportunities always for improvements, but over time we've seen an improvement and it's been working well. I think that one of the things we probably could do is provide more communication and training to all of the A&E firms involved as far as it relates to the expectations and needs of NRCS, and helping to make sure we provide proper oversight and communication of what those deliverables are and the expectation of those deliverables. So, obviously, I think if we improve some of those communication and training, we would get even better work products. As far as the future, in the next round, a decision has not been made on how that will be structured yet. That will be next year when the next round goes into place, and we'll start soliciting proposals and requirements from those interested in firms. So if there are folks interested in, we'll submit a request for proposals that will be issued next calendar year in 2022. And we'll go through the process of actually selecting new firms for that purpose. But a structure has not been decided upon whether or not, how it will go. We did do regional contracts, and I guess that's one of the things that people asked about. We did regional contracts this time when there were multiple firms to select from within a given region. And I think there's been some benefit to that and some lessons learned. So we'll build off of that going forward.
All right. Okay, let me go back up to see what we've got that came in. We've got messages that have been coming in and so forth. Some of them are giving a lot of detail that I think you may want to look at with your staff and provide the written. Just a reminder to folks, we're going to provide some written, responses to some of the ones we didn't have a chance to talk to today. So I want to make sure that you do know that. I'm going to make sure, let me go to a different part of the machine here to pull up another question or two. All right. Is there a certain amount of damage or work required before you can apply for an emergency watershed program application?
Yeah, so there has to be an impairment. So there's not an erosion related impairment and the damage didn't really threaten life or property, then it wouldn't facilitate the need for EWP assistance. And the damage needs to be defined in a way that it does threaten life or property and it's erosion related and it is causing some kind of impairment. Sometimes the damage could be that the infrastructure is gone. So there's no longer any infrastructure to protect. If there's no longer any infrastructure to protect, you at that point even wouldn't have EWP assistance. So at that point, you're saying this damage was so severe that any infrastructure that we could have protected is all gone, and there wouldn't be anything that we could do to protect any infrastructure going forward. But if there was minimal damage and there was, very little impairment, we would want our states to work closely with the sponsors to agree upon what that level should be. Then if there's modest impairments or very little to no impairment, then you may not want to, utilize EWP. If you're only talking about $1,000 or so here and there, it may not be the best interest for EWP.
Okay, very good. How about, does the EWP timeline start on the date of the federal disaster declaration? Or is it the date of the specific event?
Yeah, so one of the things that I didn't quite cover in EWP is that you can have both presidential and federal declarations for EWP. That's one of the unique things about the program. So if there is not a federal disaster declaration, there's still an opportunity for a local disaster declaration, either by the state, the governor or some state agent who has that authority, or even our state conservationists can declare a local disaster. So in the event that that happens, obviously, it's not prompted by any federal declaration and you can still participate. But the date of the disaster that the occurrence of the disaster is actually the date that you're normally looking at as far as calculating the start time. Sometimes that start time, it says in our policy and the rule says that, or the date that the site is accessible. So in the event that, the disaster occurs, but you really can't get out there and assess it, then that doesn't count against you because, you couldn't even get to the site because the disaster was such magnitude that no one could even get to the site to even assess what was going on. That shouldn't be 6 months down the road though. You may be talking weeks or so, but you're not talking months and years down the road to say that I couldn't get out there. Not that it's an inconvenience, but you physically couldn't get there. So it's normally the date of the specific disaster event that facilitates that time limit as far as those 60 days that you're talking about. And then the performance time extension, that's also facilitated by the date of that disaster. Now, the actual performance time that's documented in the agreement is actually based on the date that the agreement is signed. That's something totally different. That's the start of the performance time, that 10-day or 220 days. That's when it's facilitated. The limits of the extension is based on the disaster date.
We had quite a bit in the chat, Kevin and Jesse and Ralph, that are going to be considered, I think, in your written material that you have. Some folks gave us some really great examples and went into very good detail. But I want to make sure that before now and the conclusion of our webinar, we have a chance for the participants to actually look at this question. This question right here is so important in the feedback that we want to get from our participants. And for those of you that are still with us, we so appreciate you staying with us. And the world is ran by those that show up. And you are the ones that showed up. And you get a chance to type into the chat feature your recommendation. So type recommendation and then put down that item that you would recommend after listening to today's discussions, questions, and so forth. If you had one recommendation for Kevin, and his branch to consider, this would be it. And it could be on one of the 3 watershed programs, right, Kevin?
Correct. Yes, any of them.
Right? This would be the one recommendation that you're going to. So this is truly an opportunity for you to give that recommendation, and we're going to monitor those as you put them down. So go to the chat, type in your recommendation, send it to all so that we can all see it. That would be another feature I think that would be important for us, right? Send it to all of us, and we'll be able to see that come in, see those rolling in as you send them in. This would be the most important recommendation that you would suggest for making our watershed programs better for sponsors and partners. Okay, ready, set, type it in the chat. So the first one came in, PL566 supports nonprofit local partners financially and engagement and implementation of projects where they are most qualified to do so, would be a recommendation. We thank you for sending that one in. And we're going to harvest these and put them into our notes too, so that you've got them. So if you've got a specific recommendation based on that question that's up before you today, we want to hear from you. You can go ahead.
If I could emphasize that, Ray, this is actually part of the most important part of the presentation, is where we get this feedback and recommendations, because this is what you asked me earlier. What do we want to do, and partnering with our partners in local communities to help make the program more effective. And I think hearing these recommendations and being able to address them, not necessarily respond to them, but to address them and actually act on the recommendations is what I'm saying. That's what we want to know. So, please don't take it lightly. We want to hear from you, and no recommendation is too minor and no recommendation is too severe. This is your time to come in. And so any recommendations we have out there from folks, we encourage it. And actually that's what we want to see. So that's one of the reasons we asked for this time.
One of the recommendations is for the increase interaction between the partners and the watershed staff. So finding a way to really do that. And I know with, staff limits, there's still ways, and we're learning through the virtual systems, right? How to be able to do that. So maybe we can use that virtual system to do that. Another recommendation that came in, Kevin, and your staff, would be to keep the economic and the NEPA analysis earlier in the planning process to provide better alternatives. keep the economic and NEPA and analysis.
Mhm.
Yeah, if you want to comment on any of these, Kevin, that's great, or your staff. Another one that came in is streamline the guidelines for watershed plans. You mentioned that some of the presentation you gave, so that they're more clear and concise, especially the timeline for the engagement required. And I remember, again, you put the one slide up there, but they're saying, make sure you streamline those, make sure the expectations are clear.
Yeah, and we're actually in the process of doing some of that now. We've been working to identify ways that we can communicate clearly what the expectations are better. And I've spoken to the statements of work and the task orders that we, issue for partners and A&Es to do work. So as we communicate clearer what the expectations are there, I think that will help us to be able to get better work products, one, but also it may help us to improve some efficiency. So any opportunities we can to provide aids and additional guides and samples. So I will say this, and I think this was one of the questions that came up in one of the panels. I'm not sure if it was the west or the east. I'll just answer it here and then I'll answer it tomorrow if it comes up again. We do have sample plans that we are in the process of working with the National Water Management Center to develop. And we're actually about halfway down the road in this process of getting those developed, and they should be done by late July, I expect. That those sample plans will provide a clear roadmap for that planning process of what is expected. And I think it will be a very useful and helpful product. It's going to have instructions and notes in it, and there are going to be different types of plans based on different purposes and different types of projects. And so I really think that when you see these different development products, that you will actually see a benefit in just that one. But that's not the end of it. We're streamlining some of the efforts in the policy to include clearer information in the policy. And we're also developing more guides and aids to help communicate clearer what's expected. And we're doing more trainings. We did not get a chance to do our sponsor and our, well, actually it was an A&E training that we wanted to do last year. That was because of some of the restrictions here, but I think we're just gonna have to go virtual with it and make sure we get the A&E trainings completed so that we can actually communicate some detailed instructions and get some detailed engagement and feedback on how we can improve some of the working on the technical side for these contracts. So those are some of the things, Ray, that are actually going on now.
So another recommendation is to create a watershed program knowledgeable field office level staff to assist in making the program visible and more implementable. So going all the way to that field office level, talk to that a little bit, Kevin.
Yeah, so we've had a streamlining team actually work with us and work with senior leadership to help identify some of the needs there are for a reevaluation of how we look at watershed staffing and some proposals. We've been actually developing proposals now for a while, and I think we're getting closer to implementing some of these proposals over the course of time that we've developed to be able to actually make recommendations for really beefing up some of the staff that we have and making sure that we have staff at the very lowest level we can to make sure that we're able to assist anyone walking into the offices as it relates to watershed programs. One of the things that we're also doing is we're making efforts to have somewhat of a certification and training that will help some of the folks involved in planning and some of the folks involved in managing the program, because these programs are getting more and more robust, and they're getting more and more, I guess, interest, you would say, from the public. And as that happens, you're dealing with more opportunities and you're dealing with more challenges that may have not have existed. So what we want to do is provide as much training as possible for all the staff in the event that we can't necessarily hire a lot more watershed staff in the local offices. What we would want to do though is make sure that everyone in the local offices is at least aware of the program and can provide basic assistance. And then as we start talking about implementation, identifying ways that we can leverage some of the skills and experiences that we have throughout the agency to build a cadre of individuals who can actually help to get the implementation done quicker. And some states may have resources that can help us get things done quicker, and some of it may be the A&E firms, and just a combination of working with everyone to make it things go quicker.
Excellent. So we did receive these, and I'll just review these fairly quickly with you. And I'm sure the folks are still typing in the chat some other recommendations, but we did mention the supports of the nonprofit local partners in the engagement. We did mention the providing more interaction between the sponsors and partners with the watershed program staff, and you've covered that a little bit. And then keep the economic and the NEPA analysis earlier in the planning process. We mentioned that. Here's one in streamlining the guidelines for watershed plans that are clear and concise, especially in the timeline of engagement. And then create a watershed program knowledgeable field staff. You just referred to that one. If not already available, add a floodplain easement to public law 566 program, not just available through the EWP. And so again, we're using the nominal group process here where no idea is left unturned, right? We're just presenting these, some of them very doable right from the start. Some may take a little bit of encouragement and that sort of thing. You touched on this earlier, education of the partners and public to what the programs have to offer is key to the program success, detailing the practices offered. And I'm sure part of the dance here is that you want just enough to promote the program to the level that you can actually fund it and work it with your current staff. You don't want to
Yes.
overpromise or over expect.
Under deliver. Can I back up just a little bit to the one on the easements? So that is available and viable. So I just want to make sure I stress that. I had answered that question earlier, but maybe I didn't quite do justice. So I do want to emphasize to whoever wrote that question, that recommendation, that this is a very viable option. So if you have a desire to use the watershed program for floodplain easements, that is an option. So if you are having challenges with that, feel free to reach out to me or my staff, or I would first encourage reach out to your state staff. I'm not sure, I don't even know who the comment came from, but it may have came from an RCS person. But anyway, I would first encourage you to reach out to the state staff, and if there's any need for additional engagement, we can definitely walk you through how that viable option is truly available to you.
Another recommendation is to stress that as state conservationists, the importance of the watershed program versus the other Farm Bill programs. And as you mentioned, in conjunction with the other Farm Bill programs, the program is just as important, if not more, and since the potential to save lives. So big support here for, that and state conservationists across the nation have the opportunity to speak with a lot of folks. So they're asking that maybe some talking points there, right? It would be important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we will definitely share all these with the regional cons and everyone to make sure that everyone sees that and help, keep the interest and the importance going, elevated.
Yeah, and this elevation of a watershed program manager, similar to the requirement of a regional conservation partnership program manager, so that, to be able to grow the program within the state staff. And then develop more guides and aids for NED. Help me with NED, National Education.
Yeah, so we're actually moving to the PRNG model. So it's National Economic Development decision, but we're development. Yeah.
Okay.
So we're actually moving to more the PRNG model, where the NED is not the driving factor in some of these decisions. So that will be resolved, I think, by the release of more information on how PRNG works. So I think this recommendation is actually being addressed through us providing and communicating more information on the processes for implementing PRNG. And some of that will come in these new plans we're developing as sample plans, and some of it will come in some training that we have scheduled for just rolling out PRNG and how that analysis is to be done. And a lot of that training is actually coming from our National Water Management Center, who has economists and individuals who actually specialize in those types of more technical analysis. So, I think what we can do is communicate that there may be a public interest in some of the trainings that are provided to our state and our local staff, and RCS staff. And if there's a interest beyond that, we can maybe do some more public type trainings.
Okay. And then another recommendation here, expand the EWPP work to cover damage that is not necessarily a threat to life or infrastructure, but is a threat to ecological integrity. Also allow the replacement of failed road stream crossing infrastructure and allow increased capacity of such failed structures, replacing a failed undersized culvert with a structure with a much larger capacity, and it would pass larger floods, and to be resilient. Excellent, excellent.
Yeah, I actually like that recommendation. It may, and not that I didn't like any other recommendation, but what I'm trying to say is that it kind of really allows us to look at the program slightly different. Obviously, some of that may facilitate the need for some of a rule change for some of the what you're talking about there. So it's not as simple as just a policy change. However, I think the person who wrote it knows that and probably understands that we need to really look at re-imaging and advancing that program. So some of that may require the facilitation of some type of a rule change and to address some of these things. So I see that as a way to advance the program is what we're talking about.
Folks, you came up with great recommendations, and I'm going to stay with the webinar even after we close it, just in case you fire some other ones in to us. But keep those recommendations coming into the chat. We'll record those. We'll put those into the notes and get those to Kevin and staff. All right. My opportunity, though, to ask you one other question, and I'm expecting 106 responses to this. In what ways could the National Watershed Coalition reach you with good, timely information? So we're switching gears from NRCS. This would be Dan and Lisa and our National Watershed Coalition leaders. How would they reach you with good, timely information about watershed programs? So I'm expecting 105 responses in the chat to the best way. So go ahead and write "reach me by" doing this, whatever that is, and go ahead and type those into the chat right now. All right.
Hey, Ray, while we're getting those in the chat, may I back up and answer something that I add to an answer on something?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so a question came up about, you know, the staff and resources available to make sure we have the technical are able to provide technical assistance. I failed to mention that one of the things we're doing now is we've expanded the language of the ACES authority to include watershed operations and watershed rehab and EWP. So states actually have access now to utilize those funds to actually tap into ACES employees and bring back some skilled employees and skilled workers who can actually help advance the program. And we're actually doing it here in headquarters too. So I don't want to overlook that, because as we've seen, you know, technology and we've seen information kind of leave and experience leave the agency and walk out the door. Well, some of that we can bring back through ACES, and we now have the authority to legally do that through those 3 programs.
Wow,
so
excellent.
I wanted to share that.
So with this question up on there, I'm expecting, again, 105 responses. In what ways could the National Watershed Coalition reach you with good, timely information about the watershed programs? And so go ahead and type that in. Many of you are typing that in. You're talking about listserv emails, that sort of thing. That's Dan and his leaders really need to know how the best way to reach you will be. So go ahead and type the answer to that particular question as we go along. And what a day we've had. We're about 5 minutes from our finish. And I just want to remind everyone that Kevin early on mentioned that he will be writing responses to the questions. And so if there are questions, and Kevin, are you going to respond also to these recommendations, or are we just going to take them as is and move them?
Yeah, I didn't have an intention to respond to the recommendations, really just the questions.
Yeah.
And since we're getting a lot more questions, it may not be practical to respond to the recommendations, you know, but let's see how we go. And you've actually helped me some, because you started documenting some of the responses.
Yeah.
So I got a little bit of a head start on some of it. But if we get to a point where we've actually, you know, kind of made a lot of headway and we're able to successfully answer all the questions first, and we have good time, we may jump into some of the recommendations. But I really think that the recommendations should stand on their face and will stand, you know, on their own, and we just address them, you know.
Okay, very, very good. Well, and keep on typing the responses to in what ways could the National Watershed Coalition reach you with good, timely information about watershed programs and events. Let's talk about those programs. First, Kevin, let's go with you. Any dates coming up? You did mention these during the course of the webinar today, some dates that are coming up. You mentioned the fiscal year and et cetera.
So I'm not sure if Jesse and Ralph, I think they're still on, looks like, so I'll give them a chance. They wanted to chime in. I know Jesse has a deadline coming in June, he might want to share. And then Ralph, if you feel like you can share some of what we got as far as upcoming timelines.
Yes,
Do y'all want to chime in?
please.
Yes,
Well-
Kevin, funding request for FY 2022 should be submitted either through the rehab database or the SharePoint site by June the 30th, 2021. So we have a few requests that have come in, but not very many. So I want to encourage the states to get their funding request in June 30th. Thank you.
30th. Thanks, Jesse. Ralph, some,
Thanks, Jesse.
Hey there, as far as watershed operations is concerned, as Kevin mentioned, open opportunity for anyone who has the need to do a preliminary investigation feasibility report. There's a SharePoint site where requests can be submitted anytime, as well as for the remedial projects. If any of that pops up, that's at any time as well. And similarly, we have developed a form that can be used to submit requests for additional for either planning, design, or construction phases of work for any of the other watershed operations projects. So it's like Kevin said, we're moving towards being an open opportunity all kind of year round. As funds are available, we want to keep projects moving and not have them hesitate or have to stop just because of a scheduled date that may or may not fit the timeline for the efforts that are going on.
So when you folks mentioned SharePoint and the capability, would that be accessed through our NRCS partners?
Yeah, so I felt that may come up. So what we're talking about there is really for NRCS. So, sponsors are encouraged to know that requests that come to national headquarters have to come from the state conservationists. So
Okay.
basically, if a sponsor has a desire to participate, they first must route their request to the state conservationists. And I kind of went through some of that in the presentation, but there's not really a direct tool or resource where the sponsor can directly request assistance from headquarters. And we don't want that to happen because we want the state cons to have an input and a say so in a decision. So we want that local working. So yeah, the SharePoint is a NRCS site that's only accessible by NRCS staff, where we share information and we share the tools necessary for NRCS to submit those requests on behalf of the sponsors.
And like a couple of the recommendations said, work with your local NRCS field office first and get them engaged, get them out on the field, get them out there looking at things with you. And then they know the right people within their state office to get these inserted at the right time, the right place. Okay. Any other timelines, Kevin and team? You think?
That's probably, I think those are the only timelines upcoming for programs.
Good. Hey, Dan, how about yours? I've got a slide, I think, of the National Watershed Coalition upcoming conference. Please.
Yes, sir. That's pretty self-explanatory. I would also want to make everybody aware that between now and October the 3rd, there'll be at least a couple of more NWC hosted webinars. One that will center around improving the performance of a watershed sponsor board. And that will be done by Ray Ledgerwood of BoardWorks. And then we have another one in planning that revolves around mitigation and steps to add a water quality dimension to watershed projects. And we'll be announcing that one a little bit later in the summer. But hope to see you in Spokane. Get vaccinated and come on down.
I've been showing scenes of the Palouse the whole time when I've released my video there. So that's what you're going to be going to. Although in October, it will look different than those green fields that you see in back of me right now. But it'll still be rolling hills of lush to display. Folks, what a time we've had. Dan, any other final comments that you want to give to the group? And then
we appreciate everybody spending time with us this morning, or depending on where you are, maybe this afternoon. this has, I think, been an informative and well-done webinar, and just appreciate your participation. As always, we would welcome your membership in the Watershed Coalition. It is our members that give us our strength. So you're always invited. You'll see there my email address and our website. We also have a Facebook page that is linked to that website where you can find information from time to time. But primarily a big thank you to Kevin and his team, to you, Ray, and to all the participants who have taken time out of their day to hang out and learn more about utilizing the Watershed Program.
Thanks so much, Dan. And with that, we'll close our session today. Again, that last question was, how is the best way for the National Watershed Coalition to reach you? And go ahead and answer that question. But we'll close our webinar at just 3 minutes after the hour. So thanks so much for attending. Take care.